Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's jump right into it. July 30th, 2001 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. WWF Invasion Reviewed. More. By Dave Meltzer. Just a few weeks ago, the World Wrestling Federation appeared to be on its way down. Bad booking, lack of making fresh stars, all the usual reasons. Then, as pro wrestling shows, the right angle can turn it all around. The Invasion pay-per-view on July 22nd from the Gund Arena in Cleveland appears to have been a major success based on three things happening. 1. ECW was injected into the interpromotional angle. 2. The booking of the interpromotional angle, once head writer Stephanie McMahon and Paul Heyman was involved as characters, suddenly got inspired. And 3. They gave the fans what they wanted. The Steve Austin that sold tickets. Preliminary indicators, such as attendance at the Famous Players theaters in Canada as compared with usual shows, volume of feedback, and television ratings from July 23rd, 5.35 rating, best number since April 9th, are all positive signs of a turnaround. But regarding point 3, then it was taken away. As a show, it was just that. A show. One great match. A good main event. A few average, slightly better than average, and a few bad matches underneath. More bad than good, but it was sold as a one-match show. The two most important things about the show were getting Kurt Angle over as a top babyface, which seemed to have been accomplished, and the turn of Austin back heel after 6 days. The end result of the first Austin turn at WrestleMania less than 4 months ago was a downturn in most every facet of business. Ratings, merchandise, attendance and pay-per-view all dropped, in most cases significantly. The tease of turning him back turned things around, remarkably fast, in conjunction with the strong television main angle. So why was he turned back, especially in a business where over the past few years, as evidenced by people like Austin, Bill Goldberg, Sting, and Ric Flair, that turning a popular face heel often doesn't give him heat, it negates his box office value? Fans often simply won't pay to boo someone they don't feel like booing, so they stay home, or don't watch. There are a few reasons. First off, unlike the first time Austin turned when he had no opponents except for resurrecting an old feud with Undertaker, and the company failed to pull the trigger on creating new opponents, instead focusing on the Power Trip vignettes, which turned out to be a ratings-killing program, he is loaded with opponents now. Austin had what should be big money programs lined up with Rock and Triple H, and with Angle's turn a third program, not to mention Undertaker still in that position if they need something quick in the event of an injury since their last program was left open-ended. The heels side, due to the interpromotional angle, was being headed by Booker T, DDP and Rhino. Clearly, from a marquee value standpoint, it was totally unbalanced. Second, for the main storyline, the idea that ECW-WCW stole the WWF Championship is a strong program. The Austin turn had more impact than the other possibilities, which were Angle and Chris Jericho, since the show basically had to end with the Equith WCW winning the last match due to a member of the team turning. Clearly this is being booked as a copy of the NWO, with a very similar first angle when Hulk Hogan turned. Of course, there was a huge difference between Hulk Hogan in 1996, who nobody wanted to cheer anymore, and Steve Austin in 2001. On paper it's the right move for balancing faces and heels and having a series of marquee heel versus face main event programs. The risk that Austin's sudden invigoration, which was one of two key reasons for this show having so much interest, is negated by being in a position where he didn't draw before, although he didn't have as strong an angle, should be alleviated by the return, first of Rock, then of Triple H. The decision also appears to have been made not to go with Austin versus Rock as the main event at SummerSlam on August 19th in San Jose, and instead do the title versus title gimmick with Austin against new WCW champ Angle, who won the title at SmackDown on July 24th in Pittsburgh. It's the right call from a longevity standpoint. Rock's first big match back, which will be SummerSlam, should increase business just by his return, just as Austin's returns, just for run-ins, increased business on 2 shows last year. Then you are still saving the first Rock vs. Austin match for down the line and theoretically have another big money show. As it turned out, Austin did the main event with 3 broken bones in his back and 2 broken bones in his hand courtesy of the bump he took at the June 24th King of the Ring show when Booker T threw him over the announcer's table. Austin was x-rayed after the show, which didn't reveal any broken bones, but he was in continual pain, particularly his back when just doing anything physical, and had further tests done on July 19th which revealed the 5 breaks. He had breaks of the L2, L3 and L4 bones, which are not weight-bearing bones, so was able to gut it out in the pay-per-view. The current estimate is that Austin would return to active wrestling on August 5 in San Diego. He wasn't the only one who went into the main event hurt, as Jericho worked with a hyperextended elbow, while Angle had whiplash and a black eye from the July 17 show in Boston. The in-ring stars of Invasion were Rob Van Dam, who won the hardcore title from Jeff Hardy in the show-stealing match, and Angle, working as a face for the first time in a high-profile WWF main event, swearing on the air to give him a babyface edge. It was also interesting the positioning of matches, as the Bra and Panties tag team match was put on as the semi-final. Overall, for a show with so much hype, the undercard was a disappointment. Titles were largely rendered useless, as were match results. They actually had a good story of both teams wanting to win the majority of the matches, but there should have been something tangible. Maybe it was too early for the Raw time slot, but something of significance, like maybe matchmaking capabilities for 1 hour of each show, if the heel side won. That way Austin's turn would have been even more impactful, as not only did they get the champ, but the power to book matches. It also would have added significance to the undercard matches. If they aren't going to run two separate companies, they desperately need to whittle down the number of belts. There is no need for two tag team champions, especially when neither is that good and a unification match has already been held with one team going over. Nor two cruiserweight champions, since it's a division WWF has traditionally shit on to begin with and fans have been taught for years not to care about. If it wasn't for Van Dam and Hardy, it probably would have been considered a bad show, but good and bad on this show is something best determined in a few weeks by if the Austin Angle draws money this time. The show drew a sellout of 17,019 fans, which was 15,535 fans paying $848,060 and another $146,452 in merchandise sales. A funny thing not noticeable on television is the stage crew was still working on the set, literally until the last minute. They were even working during the heat match, sawing plywood and hammering it together to assemble the left side of the V ramp. If you notice, Chavo Guerrero Jr. had to walk down the WWF walkway because the ECW-WCW ramp wasn't finished yet. The gates opened 30 minutes later because they were also still putting up the floor seats. WWF traditionally likes to book 2 days in the arenas for pay-per-view events, with the first day being the setup. They couldn't in this case because the WNBA Rockers game the night before went long, since it was NSYNC Experience Night, which featured a post-game party with the new NSYNC album. The cleanup crew didn't even get started until 11 p.m. the night before, which explained the timing problems. The WWF reached a temporary agreement 2 days before the show to use the ECW name through July 31st. Trustee Barbara Balaber-Strauss maintained that the ECW intellectual property was owned by the estate of ECW and controlled by her, and the WWF's usage of it up to that point had been unauthorized, particularly after she received complaints about its usage from ECW creditors. WWF upped its offer of $150,000 last week for the trademarks and videotape library, which had been turned down, to $250,000, and agreed to send a non-refundable cash advance of $50,000 on July 23, the first day of business after the agreement, on the proposed purchase. Since thus far WWF appears to be the only interested party, Strauss, upon receiving the offer, waived the rights to take legal action against WWFE for its previous unauthorized use of the ECW name. If another party offers more for the ECW trademarks and videotape library, WWF would forfeit its cash advance. This agreement doesn't bind creditors to be unable to sue for alleged damages, but in the agreement, the WWF did indemnify Strauss against any possible legal action taken from them using the trademarks during the period it was unauthorized. The WWF's legal claim is that nobody owns the ECW name because the trademarks had been abandoned when ECW went out of business and filed for bankruptcy, because Paul Heyman, the owner of HHG, claimed to have abandoned his rights to the trademarks before filing for the bankruptcy. The WWF claimed because nobody had rights to the trademark, it doesn't need any consent or permission from the trustee or anyone to use them. However, Balaber-Strauss didn't see things that way and asserted a liability claim against WWFE for infringing upon the trademark and unauthorized use of the ECW intellectual property in doing the television angle. In order to avoid legal action between the two sides, the agreement was reached. The agreement has the trustee or any future owners of the trademarks or intellectual property, but not current debtors, forever discharges any claims against WWFE for its usage of the ECW name, as well as people doing business with WWFE. During the days leading up to the pay-per-view, at least one WWF business partner, Famous Players Theatres in Canada, had requested the WWF send them a signed legal paper indemnifying them by the WWF of any future legal risks, provided a ECW creditor would come after them as well for using the names in selling tickets to the pay-per-view. This also gave WWF rights to use any trademark name of a wrestling character, storylines or character wrestling history from ECW, and allowed WWF to fictionally portray on television that Stephanie McMahon is the owner of ECW, at least without the bankruptcy court's interference. The agreement allows WWF to continue using what the trustee claims is the ECW intellectual property at least through July 31st. After that point, if a final deal isn't made for the WWF to purchase the trademarks and IP, Balabar Strauss can pull the WWF rights to use it by giving them 72 hours written notice. If a third party ends up buying the rights, the WWF will have 30 days from the time the deal is finalized to end all usage of the intellectual property and trademarks, although WWF would maintain the rights to sell television tapes forever that were done during the time frame that used the IP or trademarks. 2 matches were added at the last minute: Raven vs. William Regal and Big Show, and Billy Gunn and Albert vs. Chris Kanyon and Hugh Morris and Sean Stasiak. The idea was just to get more people on the show, but in the case of those 2 matches, less was definitely more, as they didn't help and took time away from some matches that could have benefited from more time. Then again, had they taken 10 minutes from the main event, they could have accomplished the same purpose. Also, the way things were booked, they needed a tie going into the last match, although with no stakes specific as to what the winner would get. There wasn't that much interest in who won how many matches. I guess they could have switched the result of the Edge and Christian match and not added the 2 matches, which were both with ECW wins. The other results politically were pretty much locked. APA had to win, or WWF would have both its champs lose the interpromotional. Trish and Lita had to win because the idea was to get Tori Wilson and Stacy Keibler over by people seeing them in their undies. Obviously Earl Hebner wasn't going to lose to Nick Patrick. A. Chavo Guerrero Jr., Salvador Guerrero III, pinned Scotty 2 Hottie, Scott Garland, in 6:43 on Sunday Night Heat. Crowd was into it more than usual for a junior heavyweight match. Guerrero looked good, but Scotty was out of position a lot. Fans were not happy when Guerrero kicked out of the worm. It's like everyone knows that move is a ridiculous finisher, but they love it anyway, and Guerrero ruined the illusion as opposed to kicked out to make the match better. Some good near falls, including Scotty getting a 2 with a power slam catching Guerrero, who springboarded into the ring. Guerrero hit the brainbuster for the win. Much better than most Heat pre-pay-per-view matches because they were given time. 2 1/4 stars. 1. Edge, Adam Copeland, and Christian, Jay Resso, defeated Lance Storm, Lance Evers, and Mike Awesome and Mike Alfonso, in 10-10. Match had its ups and downs. Some sloppiness early but built well, and good near falls at the end. Awesome took a bump from a missed drop kick by Edge. Then Storm nearly killed himself taking a bump over the top. Then Christian slipped off Edge's back. His foot caught the ropes trying to do a big dive, and he also could have been hurt, but everyone seemed okay. Storm threw Christian into the post, and they seemed to have differing ideas exactly when and where the whip was going to start the heat on Christian. Christian reversed Awesome's power bomb off the top. Probably a good idea. Last guy to take it was Vampiro. Some good near falls. Awesome went for the Awesome bomb on Edge, but Christian speared him and Edge fell on top for the pin. 2 1/2 stars. 2. Earl Hebner pinned Nick Patrick, Joe Hamilton Jr., in 2:50 in the Battle of Referees. Now that they did the match, I have even less clue as to why. Mick Foley was referee. All the WCW refs attacked Hebner, so Foley kicked them out. Hebner won with the spear. Patrick wrestled for a few years in the 80s and was pretty entertaining. Hebner, who is older and has had some serious health problems, was really blown up. Short enough that it wasn't that bad, but in hindsight there was no reason for it. 3. APA, John Layfield and Ron Simmons, defeated Sean O'Hare and Chuck Palumbo in a non-title battle of WWF Tag Champs against WCW Tag Champs in 7:17. Palumbo and O'Hare were aggressive but didn't get much heat. All brawling, and pretty stiff. Bradshaw pinned Palumbo with the clothesline. For what in another era would have been such an important deal, this was really nothing. 1 stars. 4. Billy Kidman, Peter Gruner, pinned X-Pac, Sean Waltman, in 7:12 in a battle of WCW Cruiserweight Champ versus WWF Light Heavyweight Champ with neither title at stake. X-Pac was still booed, even on the WWF team, and played heel from the start. The word on Kidman was always that he desperately needed a new ring outfit. Now that he's got one, he still does, as those tight biker shorts are so 4 years ago. X-Pac did a Silver King plancha. Kidman kicked out of the X Factor and got the pin with a shooting star press. Nothing wrong with the match, but nothing compared with Kidman's matches on WCW pay-per-view events. 2 stars. 5. Raven Scott Levy pinned William Regal, Aaron Matthews, in 6:34. This match didn't get over at all. Crowd was dead except boring chants, and in the ring it was a major style clash. Raven did a leg sweep into the barricades. Regal is an old school wrestler and Raven is a creative garbage wrestler. Finish saw Taz interfere and suplex Regal, allowing Raven to get the pin with a DDT. 1/4 star. 6. Chris Kanyon, Chris Klusaritis, and Sean Stasiak, Sean Stepich, and Hugh Morris, William DeMott, defeated Big Show, Paul White, and Billy Gunn, Monty Sopp, and Albert Matt Bloom, in 4:23. Fans didn't seem to care about Gunn, who did that heel turn that nobody was and didn't register. They didn't know how to take Albert, since he's on TV as a heel. WWF guys did a triple press slam spot to open the match. Kanyon did a traditional Russian leg sweep, followed by a face-first version. A couple of near falls and saves before Stasiak did a reverse DDT to Gunn and Morris pinned him. 1/4 star. 7. Yoshihiro Tajiri pinned Taz, Pete Sinurka, in 5:43. Tajiri is great. Taz looked slow and rusty, but still throws a mean suplex. Tajiri carried it with his great kicks and the tarantula. Tajiri was throwing kicks when Taz blocked one and suplexed him. Tajiri blew the green mist and kicked Taz in the side of the face for the pin. 1 3/4 stars. 8. Rob Van Dam Robert Satkowski pinned Jeff Hardy in 12:24 to win the WWF Hardcore title. Before the match in the dressing room, Van Dam hit Matt Hardy with a chair to take him out of the show and build a little heat for the match. Lots of Van Dam chants to start the match. He did some nice acrobatic spots early. At one point both guys walked the barricade and collided. Van Dam did a moonsault body block off the barricade outside, and a twisting leg drop off the apron to Hardy's back. Hardy did a sick-looking power bomb over the top rope with Van Dam's back of his head hitting the floor. Hardy then grabbed a 12-foot ladder, said to be 20, which would be the case if both these guys were actually 10 feet tall. Hardy climbed to near the top of the ladder, perched outside the ring. Van Dam tipped it over and Hardy took a nasty spill on the floor. Hardy came back with a chair to Van Dam's back, leading to a Van Daminator knocked Hardy off the stage. Back in the ring, Van Dam dropkicked a chair into Hardy's face, which seemed to be the spot where Hardy's head split open pretty big, which may have been a hard way. Van Dam did a split-legged moonsault, but Hardy got his knees up and DDT'd Van Dam on his head. Hardy missed his swanton and Van Dam got the pin with a frog splash onto the title belt on Hardy's chest. Easily the show stealer. 4 stars. 9. Trish Stratus, Patricia Strategias, and Lita, Amy Dumas, beat Tori Wilson and Stacy Keibler in a double bra and panties match in 5:04. Foley refereed the match. It was what you'd expect, mainly women tearing clothes off each other. All four were in their bras when the WCW women had their pants taken off to lose. Keibler didn't seem that happy about being in her bra, like her parents actually didn't encourage her to be a stripper growing up. Match was long enough to where they actually tried some wrestling between the clothes ripping, and that was predictably awful. 10. Team Equith WCW of the Dudleys, Mark LaMonica and Devin Hughes, and Rhino Terry Guerin, and Diamond Dallas Page, Paige Falkenberg, and Booker T. Booker Huffman beat Team WWF of Steve Austin, Steve Williams, and Kurt Angle and Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine, and Undertaker, Mark Calloway and Kane Glenn Jacobs, in 29:03. Everyone worked hard, and this was good, but not the caliber of most WWF main events. Austin and Angle in particular got huge reactions when they came out. Vince, Shane, Paul Heyman and Stephanie were all brought out to ringside, but until the finish, none played a part in the match. Austin didn't look good as far as moving early, but seemed to get into it as the match got going. He picked his spots and actually did more than I figured he would. He did a superplex off the top to Rhino early on. Match would have been better served being a little shorter, as it dragged in the middle. Austin tagged in at 11 minutes and kicked the hell out of Booker. Austin even did a suplex on the floor to Booker. Jim Ross went off on WCW and ECW here. He said WCW as an organization was dormant for years and that ECW created a style that was career-shortening. DDP did a diamond cutter to Angle but Undertaker saved. Michael Cole thought it was a neckbreaker. Rhino accidentally gored Booker. Undertaker gave Page a choke slam, and Page got away from the last ride, so Undertaker gave ref Charles Robinson the last ride. At this point, everyone was seemingly dead. Kane choke slammed D. Von through the English announcer's table, but Angle and Rhino suplexed Bubba through the Spanish table. Austin was on the floor selling his knee big time, with a fake EMT guy helping him out. For some reason, this was never acknowledged. I can't believe something so important was missed, so it appeared they now have the mindset that if they ignore important parts of the match, that fans will think, aha, the announcers aren't talking about it even though we are seeing it, so it must be real. They need to be thinking about the other 95% of the audience. Jericho came off the apron and knocked Rhino through the table. Jericho ended up getting hurt while Undertaker and Page both brawled to the back. Guess Undertaker isn't willing to lay down and they didn't want him around for the finish, I guess because it wouldn't look good for him to not go after Austin and he wasn't going to be laid out. Angle slam on Bubba and Angle lock on Booker, but Booker kicked Angle off into ref Mike Chioda, so he was down. Vince grabbed the WWF title belt to throw to Austin, but Shane got the belt and hit Vince with it. Angle knocked Shane out of the ring and gave Booker the Angle slam and had him in the ankle lock. Booker was tapping, but no ref. Austin then made his miraculous comeback, throwing Chioda in the ring, but he then kicked Angle and gave him a stunner, put Booker on top, and ordered the ref to count. The show ended with Austin in the ring drinking beer with Shane, Stephanie, and Heyman. 3.5 stars. If there are lessons to be learned of the tragic life of Terry Gordy, it may be the typical lessons hammered home so many times in this industry. Too much partying works against you in the long run, even when you have a natural aptitude for the industry. The so-called naturals often peak young and don't have the staying power because the things that keep you close to your peak into your 30s requires discipline. Those that have a lot of success quickly often don't learn that discipline. Not taking care of injuries, even when the injury seems to come at an opportune time, affects one's career and more often than not, their long-term financial livelihood at the other end. While we marvel at just how talented Gordy really was, main eventing the Superdome at the age of 18 and a national television star a year later, there is some question about an industry where someone has their first pro match at 13 and is on the road working full-time in a major promotion before the age of 16. Gordy was almost like the old story of the major league phenoms of old, in the majors at 15, and so few of them ever reached the potential predicted of them. Maybe Gordy, who was a top 10 wrestler in the world for many years, came closer to his full potential than those baseball prodigies of old. Gordy passed away at the age of 40 on July 16, a heart attack caused by a blood clot in the heart at his home in Soddy Daisy, Tennessee, near the Tennessee/Georgia border, and Rossville, Georgia, the town he grew up in as the local celebrity. He had been complaining of chest pains for a few weeks and had told people 2 days earlier that his chest was really tight, but he attributed it to being at the gym and working chest on July 13. His lasting legacy in wrestling seems to be that no heavyweight wrestler of the modern era was as good in the ring so young, and had so much success at an early age in so many different places. At his peak he was among the best workers of the near 300-pounders ever in pro wrestling. Although his biggest money years working for All Japan followed, Gordy's career in the ring seemed to peak at the age of 25. At that point he held the Universal Wrestling Federation Championship, the world title of the number 3 promotion in the country, headed by Bill Watts. He was the in-ring cornerstone of the fabulous Freebirds, perhaps the most charismatic trio in pro wrestling history. It was during that period that he blew out his knee, the first of many knee injuries he was to suffer. Because he was world champion and because of the nature of the business in those days, rather than take off the 6 months it would have required to fix the knee ligament problems, he bandaged it up and kept working hard night after night, in title matches that on occasion lasted as long as 1 hour. Although he remained a top performer, the knee never fully recovered and remained a weakness for the rest of his career. This led to subsequent knee injuries, which worsened due to the physical demands of the All Japan style, which at the time was the toughest in the world. Gordy was always in Japan a key part of the main event mix, generally considered the most talented of the big foreigners, even though Stan Hansen, by then past his prime, remained the big gun. But it was Gordy who was called on to work so many big matches for the company, as people like Mitsuharu Misawa, Kenta Kobashi, Akira Tao and Toshiaki Kawada were elevating themselves to superstardom and Jun Akiyama was starting to get noticed, which was one of the hottest period in the history of the promotion. Whether those injuries led to an increased reliance on pain pills is hard to say. They certainly weren't a deterrent. But Gordy was a heavy partier and a wildman, at times outside the ring, long before injuries. Lots of people have to bump it up, their personalities, for television, said Michael Hayes, now 42, who called the dealing with the death of his longtime best friend this past week, because it was so sudden and unexpected, the biggest challenge of his life. We had to tone it down. We probably owe a lot of apologies to a lot of people. We were taught that in pro wrestling, you live your gimmick. I'm really proud of what we accomplished because it's something they can never take away from us, he said. You wouldn't believe how much trouble we had as teenagers in a man's business. Gordy was the kind of guy those in wrestling would tell wild stories about, but in a nice way. He didn't seem to be a bad guy, but he grew up and achieved fame probably too young to handle it. He got caught up in a world that led him to tragedy, much like so many others of his age and environment when wrestling caught fire in Dallas. Many stories told of times where Gordy would party too much, get wildly out of control, wound up the next day with Gordy not remembering much about it, and sheepishly apologizing for whatever disturbances he caused that he couldn't remember. There was one story that made the papers in Dallas when, arrested for being intoxicated in public, it took several officers to subdue him, and even when they finally handcuffed him, he headbutted the headlight out and with his head, dented up the police car. The next day when he woke up, he was calm, apologetic and signing autographs for everyone at the jail. Ted DiBiase, now 47, whose career intertwined with Gordy in the Mid-South, Georgia and Japan, remembered an incident in the Orient when he and Gordy were invited over to dinner by a wealthy pearl dealer who was a big fan and known for being well connected with merchants who were known for giving the boys good deals. Both being familiar with Japanese customs by this point, they understood the honor of a Japanese inviting them to their house and were on their best behavior. Gordy kept himself from drinking, but the host, who knew Gordy's fondness for Jack Daniels, gave him a bottle as a present. The more Gordy drank, the wilder he became, before DiBiase had to apologize, telling the host that they've got to get out before this wild bull destroys the home, and call it an early evening to take Gordy back. On the trip back, Gordy, who passed out in the cab, would wake up and get out of control, with DiBiase continually trying to keep him under wraps until they finally got to the hotel. Once they got to the hotel, DiBiase had to put Gordy in a baggage cart and wheel him up to his room because he was totally out. As DiBiase grabbed Gordy's key to open the door, Gordy awoke, hit DiBiase in the back as he was putting the key in the door, and the key broke in the door. There was a hilarious scene of 3 Japanese hotel employees with tweezers and flashlights trying to get the broken part of the key out of the door, before they gave up in despair and just deposited Gordy in a vacant room. At 1 p.m. the next day, DiBiase got a phone call. It was Gordy asking Ted, "Did I phone star 2 stars up really bad last night?" "Pretty bad, Terry. Because I woke up and my room looked different and all my clothes are gone. I didn't know where I was." But he had a heart of gold, DiBiase recalled. He was a lot like Kerry Von Erich in that way. DiBiase, who was really saddened because he was speaking in Chattanooga, where Gordy lived, the day before he died. He had lost touch with him, since he noted it's hard to keep in contact with his old wrestling friends who are constantly changing phone numbers, and didn't call or see him. He recalled so many things about Gordy, from the time he first met him when Gordy was only 18 years old and showed up with Hayes in the Mid-South Territory, and they set it on fire with their feud with the Junkyard Dog and partners like DiBiase, Bill Watts, and Buck Robley. Like most who remember the Freebirds from the beginning, there was Hayes, one of the great talkers of all time and one of the great heels of the modern era, but not exactly a wrestler that opponents relished working with. Retired from the ring and an announcer with the WWF, the glory days of the Freebirds are ancient history for many in such a fast-moving profession. Hayes had a vaunted worked punch, which looked great, because some would tell you it wasn't much of a work, and in those days a lot of wrestlers hated to work with him. Gordy, who was one of the great workers even as a teenager, was the one carrying the match, almost a southern version of the Adrian Adonis and Jesse Ventura team, which was on top in the AWA at about the same time. They set attendance records throughout Watts' territory and were the heels responsible for making Junkyard Dog the all-time biggest draw the state of Louisiana ever had. They hooked up with Buddy Roberts, who is now living near Chicago and needing a voice box to talk after a long bout with throat cancer. Roberts came in as a single, and Watts put them together because while Gordy and Hayes were drawing money, they were very green in other ways. Roberts was an experienced star who was part of one of the 70s best tag teams, the Hollywood Blondes, with partner Jerry Brown and manager Sir Oliver Humperdinck. Roberts' career had sputtered as a single after a gimmick in Texas as Dale Valentine, the supposed younger brother of Johnny, as an excuse for Johnny, then crippled, to work ringside as his manager. Since some of the wrestlers didn't like working with Hayes at the time, Watts had the idea it would create even more heat if Hayes did all the talking, and acted like a manager, with the heat being Hayes was hiding behind the veteran wrestler and the huge prodigy. They created the idea of the 3-man team, a staple of Mexican wrestling but pretty much unheard of in the U.S. by the time they got to Georgia in late 1980 and won the Georgia, which later became the national tag team titles. The idea was that any 2 of the 3 could defend it. Watts, a stickler for credibility, didn't go for that concept, but that became their trademark when they hit Atlanta and became national superstars on TBS. "We had to be frustrating to Buck Robley, the booker at the time for Watts," Hayes recalled. "We were very green, but we were drawing. He thought Buddy could teach us. Gordy and Hayes were against the idea of adding Roberts to the act when Watts suggested it to them. Hayes told Watts, "What if I don't want to do that?" Watts responded immediately, "Are you guys giving me your notice?" Gordy and Hayes first thought of Roberts as a veteran office stooge, but on a trip from Jackson, Mississippi to Shreveport, Louisiana, after shaving cream and pissing on each other, literally, as the Freebirds in that era were known for giving people they liked and sometimes didn't like as well golden showers, for 220 miles, Roberts was officially a free bird for life, even if Hayes and Gordy at that time thought it was only temporary. Word in wrestling traveled much slower, in fact, didn't travel hardly at all in those days. The Freebirds could have been doing big business in Louisiana, but nobody outside the territory would know. Dusty Rhodes and Ole Anderson were booked for a major show, and on seeing them, Ole asked them to come to Atlanta. Gordy actually had his first pro wrestling match at the age of 13 at the Rip Television Studio in Rossville, Georgia, his hometown, teaming with Eddie Griffin as a tag team called the Masked Scavengers. As a huge kid, he was already a star in baseball and football, but didn't pursue sports as he dropped out of school in the 9th grade to pursue pro wrestling. Even as a freshman, the combination of his size and speed already made college coaches salivate. His wrestling career was apparently guided by his uncle, known as Hook, because he only had one arm. His uncle told his high school football coach, Lynn Murdoch of Rossville High, that Terry wasn't coming back to school for his sophomore year. The uncle, lured by the prospects of him as a pro wrestling, told Murdoch that in 1 year, he'd make more than the coach and within 2 years would be making $100,000 per year. At the time that sounded ridiculous. He was Terry Mecca, working for Angelo Poffo's ICW with the likes of Randy Savage and Lanny Poffo at 14. There was no money there, but it did pay off later. He was already working main event programs by his 16th birthday, working as the top babyface and holding the Mississippi title for Gil and George Culkin in 1977 and 1978, who were running opposition to Bill Watts at the time. He left the territory for Memphis the first time after losing a hair match and came to Memphis for a few weeks. Those who remember 15-year-old Gordy showing up in Memphis described him as a 260-pound kid, with a short crew cut from losing the hair match, with 2 left feet, contrary to legend of him always being a great worker. He met Michael Zeitz, who was wrestling in Alabama under the name Lord Michael Hayes in Mississippi, and they worked in Alabama and Mississippi as a tag team. While in Alabama, he was among a bunch of wrestlers in the promotion, some of whom would go on to pretty decent stardom, including Ricky and Robert Gibson, David Schultz and Dennis Condrey, to get work for Al's Inc. in Nova Scotia. By the time he met Zeitz, he was already a good worker and was the darling of the booker, Frankie Kane, better known as the Great Mephisto. Gordy was the top face while Hayes was a heel, and in those days, because of kayfabe, they had to sneak around to hang out together in private. When I met him, I told him, "You'll make it for sure, and somehow, I'm gonna make it. But if we get together, we'll make it that much quicker," Hayes recalled. Hayes, then 18, went to Germany on a tour with the Samoans, and came back and convinced Kane to turn Gordy heel and put them together as a tag team. Kane was against the idea at first, because the idea for tag teams had usually been 2 similar style performers with similar looks, and they didn't fit the bill. But when business picked up with them as the top heels, he went with it until a night in Natchez, Mississippi, where the house was up significantly, and Hayes, seeing just a $50 payoff, confronted the office and got a "you don't like it, then leave" response. Hayes walked out the door. Then in the car, realizing what he'd done, thought he had just screwed up his career. Sitting in the car, contemplating his next move, he was shocked, a few minutes later, when Gordy came into the car. His first words were, "Where are we going?" As he had just gone to the promoters and told them if Hayes left, he was leaving with him. By 1978, Hayes, now known as Pretty Boy Michael Hayes, became full-time tag partners with Gordy, working for Nick Gula's out of Nashville, feuding with Gula's territory-killing son, George, and the great worker to carry him named Bobby Eaton. By this time Gordy was already a polished worker. It was there that Hayes first suggested the idea of coming to the ring to the song Free Bird, which is what the two will always be remembered for. Hayes said he actually first came up with the idea at the age of 14, when he was working putting rings up in Pensacola and going to Southern rock concerts, and would see some of the same faces at both shows and thought the marriage of the two would be a great idea. He went to Gula's and Booker Tom Renisto, after it took him a year to convince Gordy to go for it, with the idea of dimming the house lights, putting the spotlight on them like what he'd seen at rock concerts, and them coming to the ring to the song Free Bird. Gula's looked at Tom Renisto Sr. and told him, "I think those boys are taking them marijuana pills again," Hayes recalled. After leaving that territory and going to Memphis, Jerry Jarrett was the first promoter to allow Hayes to see his vision, and the Fabulous Freebirds were born in 1978, when they showed up in Memphis for a 3-month run. Their debut coincided with the Wrestling Fans International Association convention, a group of what would have been the forerunner of hardcore fans who came from around the country once a year to meet. From that group included such people as the late Brian Hildebrand, Jim Cornette, Eddie Gilbert and Paul Heyman, although Heyman may not have been at this specific convention, the latter three of whom ended up being major players in the industry behind the scenes. He pretty much shocked everyone, because in those days, stars had reps and unknowns weren't supposed to be able to talk like Hayes, who would use lyrics from popular songs in his interviews, let alone work like Gordy. While the Freebirds take credit, and perhaps they should, for entrance music, a staple of pro wrestling and one of the reasons it became as big an entertainment form years later, they were not the first to do so. Gorgeous George in the 50s came out to pomp and circumstance, but as big as George got, it never caught on with the other wrestlers. Leroy Rochester in the 70s took on the name Bad Leroy Brown, from a hit song by Jim Croce at about the same time. Junkyard Dog soon followed, after what saw the success of the Freebirds with the music in Louisiana, coming out to Another One Bites the Dust. This was all before the Freebirds arrived in Atlanta and put entrance music on the map for good when they showed up on WTCG in the fall of 1980 for the entire country to see. The first Freebird interview at the WMC TV studios, and match where the two faced the top two local babyfaces, Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee, is one of those tape collector's classics of the era. Hayes, quoting from Popular Music, said the two were the hot childs of the city. He does run wild. And I do look pretty. Hayes, then 18, was already doing the strut he'd become famous for. By this time Gordy, 16, had improved immensely in the ring, doing amazing bumps reminiscent of the likes of a Ric Flair, and blowing nearly everyone in the territory away with his work. Their 2 of 3 fall first television match was memorable because it was the debut of them under the name The Fabulous Freebirds, and also because during the second fall on live television, Hayes shit in his pants, literally. He had to run to the restroom during the television commercial break between falls. The Freebirds were booked as the number 2 heel team, however, behind Wayne Ferris, later known as Honky Tonk Man, and Larry Latham, later known as Moondog Spot, known then as the Blonde Bombers, even though the Freebirds were already far better in the ring and often stole the shows. Soon the fans were cheering them and Jarrett decided to turn them babyface. I'll never forget the look on Lawler's face, Hayes said. The entire place was standing when they came down the aisle at the Coliseum and the music played. When they got to television the next Saturday came word that they were being turned back heel. Eddie Marlin and Bill Dundee told them that Jarrett saw the tape and thought they hadn't gotten over big enough so was switching them back. Lawler then came in with a different story, saying they had gotten over so huge that Jarrett decided to turn them heel for a top program. They knew management was lying to them in some form, which led to their decision to leave for Mid-South. After Mid-South, they showed up on Georgia Championship Wrestling, the top-rated cable show in the nation, in September of 1980 as a 3-man team with the idea that any 2 of the 3 could wrestle, although in most cases it was Gordy and Roberts. It was almost always Gordy and someone. They were immediately put on top, winning the tag team titles in a 3-way over the area's top heel team of the 60s, the Masked Assassins. Although these weren't the same famous duo, Jody Hamilton was the same, but his new partner was Roger Smith, and the area's all-time top babyface team, Mr. Wrestling, Tim Wooden, and Mr. Wrestling 2, Johnny Walker. Things started out well, even though Anderson didn't quite understand the music and the ring outfits, but let them do it, and they got over remarkably fast. They were in main events in weeks, champs within a month, and in less than 2 months Gordy was in a singles main event at the Omni against Jack Briscoe. But then Anderson quit as booker and was replaced by Robert Fuller who, when it came to logic, was a far cry from either Anderson or Watts. The territory was going down fast with the Freebirds on top feuding with Fuller, Ted DiBiase and 6'9", 430-pound Stan Frazier, a hideous worker and a name that most involved roll their eyes when talking about. After Fuller was gone, and replaced by Rob Lee, they started to recreate old Mid-South angles that had drawn big money. While not the success they were in Louisiana since Junkyard Dog wasn't as over as a babyface in Georgia, they did turn things around somewhat. The most famous angle of that time wasn't a recreation, and it's one that probably everyone who saw it likely still remembers due to its dramatic nature. In a televised tag match against DiBiase and Junkyard Dog, Gordy piledrove DiBiase on the floor. In those days, that was an angle and a stretcher job all by itself. But DiBiase, who was being pushed as the super babyface because they were grooming him for the NWA title, which he never got, but that's another story, somehow got up and rolled into the ring. He then kicked out of the pin, which nobody at the time expected, and the shock of it not being the finish, made the angle. After 2 more piledrivers in the ring, DiBiase bit a condom he'd kept in his mouth filled with blood, which made it appear he was internally bleeding as the blood came out of his mouth. They did the stretcher job, and to give it authenticity, DiBiase went to the hospital, working everyone at the hospital that the angle was real and his neck was badly injured. Announcer Gordon Solie gave the name of the hospital DiBiase had been rushed to, lending authenticity. The hospital was flooded with phone calls from all over the country. Those who called were, in fact, told, because the hospital employees knew no better, that DiBiase really was in the hospital with a severe neck injury. DiBiase worked the hospital employees for a week regarding neck pain and spent the week in bed, filled with morphine, before getting released. Several weeks later, he returned to a big pop on television, and the feud was back on. They also retold the story of what is to this day the biggest angle ever in New Orleans, when Hayes used the famous secret Freebird cream, that'll take people back a few decades to a time when the Freebirds debuted catchphrases in interviews, except they didn't have a term then, talking about growing up on Bad Street, USA. The further down the block you went the better it got, and we lived in the last house on the right. The drug-induced exploits on the so-called Freebird Mountain, believed to be actually Lookout Mountain in Georgia, and so many others, to blind Jid, with the idea he was blind the day his first daughter was born. The angle, which was blown off before nearly 30,000 fans at the Superdome, is a figure that to this day has never been equaled in that city. The Freebirds, like the Road Warriors of a few years later, because of the music and the charisma, ended up being half babyfaces in Atlanta, where to most of the crowd, particularly the older audience, they were the top heels. But to a lot of males 15 to 25, due to the song and the attitude, they were already getting cheered. They dominated the tag team scene in Georgia through the summer of 1981. Instead of turning face as a trio, Roberts left and Hayes and Gordy split. Hayes went babyface for a tag team feud, with Hayes first teaming with Kevin Von Erich, as irony would have it, and later with former Oakland Raiders star Otis Sistrunk, who only lasted a few weeks before finding wrestling wasn't to his liking, against Gordy with new partner Jimmy Snuka. There was the scene when Jos LeDuc was doing a feat of strength, where they put the brick on his head and broke it with a sledgehammer. Gordy told kids that he thinks they should all try something like that at home, causing Solie to legitimately freak out. Gordy, and eventually Hayes, left for Southeastern Championship Wrestling, continuing their feud from national TV. Having been there long enough, Hayes felt it was time for him to return to Atlanta, and gave notice. In his last match in the territory, Gordy beat Hayes in a hair versus hair match in a cage. Gordy wanted to go to a territory where he could be the top singles star, and Hayes was just happy being able to spend 3 nights a week at home in Pensacola for the first time in years. They thought it was time to get off national television before they burned out, but knew after a rest, they had to return. As the group of heels led by LeDuc and the Sheepherders were giving the beaten Hayes a beating after he had lost, and before cutting his hair, Gordy snapped, saved his former partner from the haircut, and turned himself babyface. A short time later, when Hayes was attacked on Atlanta TV by Buzz Sawyer and Kevin Sullivan, Gordy returned to make the save, and the tape from Alabama of them getting back together was shown nationally. The team was back together, as full-fledged babyfaces on national TV. While the angle in Alabama with Gordy's turn was a classic, it was all more coincidence than something well planned out. The return to Atlanta didn't last long, as Hayes and Anderson had their problems and Hayes was fired, or quit, as they both sort of happened simultaneously. It was announced on television a few days later that he had suffered a broken leg, to send him the message that he couldn't come back anytime soon. Next stop was Dallas. At the time, Dallas was a struggling territory. While it had some huge peaks earlier on and was a wrestling hotbed in the early 70s, Fritz Von Erich, promoter Jack Adkisson, had retired a few months earlier at a show at Texas Stadium which only drew 6,000 fans. The promotion was really just designed by Fritz to be a vehicle to make stars and eventually NWO world champions out of his 3 sons, who had become very popular with teenagers. But their big crowds were usually limited to appearances by Ric Flair as world champion defending against one of the sons. The Freebirds had met Gary Hart, Gary Williams, the Dallas booker at the time, when he would come to Atlanta for television and big shows with a great kabuki, Akihisa Mara, who feuded with Dusty Rhodes. At the time, Dallas wasn't the place you went to either to further your career or to make money, and Hayes was only planning on going for a week or 2 before venturing to a big money territory. But he was there when they had a big show with Flair in San Antonio, and the kids challenging Flair always did business. Hayes smelled something, called up Gordy that night, and told him to give his notice in Atlanta. Hayes and Gordy actually arrived as babyfaces, with the story being that they had befriended David, the wildest of the brothers, when David wrestled in Georgia. David actually never wrestled in Georgia, and Kevin actually was Hayes' tag partner for a few weeks in Atlanta. At the time, the Freebirds, having been successful draws in much hotter territories and coming off national exposure, were seen as far too big stars for an office that wasn't doing much business. In one of those rare nights where wrestling history changed, December 25, 1982, Flair and Kerry Von Erich wrestled before 12,000 fans, the largest crowd to witness wrestling in that part of the country since Fritz Glory days, against the likes of Dory Funk Jr., in a cage match at Reunion Arena for the NWA title, with Hayes as referee, voted on by the fans since referee problems in the past had cost Kerry an earlier title match with Flair. Gordy was appointed by Hayes to watch the door to keep any heels from interfering. Earlier in the show, the promotion created the world's six-man titles, which over the next few years, became the biggest drawing belt in the territory and among the hottest titles in all of wrestling. It was and still remains the only time in a major American promotion where the six-man titles were a bigger drawing title than either the main singles or tag team titles, largely due to the rivalry. The Freebirds, with Roberts returning, were scheduled against champs Bill Irwin and Great Kabuki and the Mongol. To make the story even better, Roberts missed the show due to a plane delay. David, being their friends from Georgia, volunteered to take his place, actually scored the winning fall, and then announced he was giving Roberts the third belt since he figured if the situation was reversed, that would be the right thing to do. In one of the classic matches of the 80s, both for ring work and more for turning a territory around in one night, Kerry had the match won, but Hayes suddenly started subtlety healing as ref. Finally, Gordy slammed the cage door on Kerry's head, causing him to lose, and Freebirds vs. Von Erichs was born. It was the right program to turn around a territory at the right time. 5 guys ranging in age from 22 to 25, all charismatic in their own way, and veteran Roberts, an established ring general whose own fondness for the bottle did little to teach a more calm demeanor to his younger brothers. World class built around this program, and with production values of television, a 6-camera shoot, something never done before in wrestling, started syndicating the show nationally, and even internationally, and it was a particular hit in the Middle East. With the Freebirds as such great heels introducing vignettes, the idea of Keith Mitchell and Dan Bynum, to the world of pro wrestling, such as where they'd be in public with announcer Bill Mercer and be wise asses, such as going to drive-through windows at fast food places and not paying, or going places and sticking Mercer with the check. It changed television wrestling forever. It was no longer a typical low-rent wrestling TV show, but a well-produced television show, ironically syndicated by the Christian Broadcasting Network. The Von Erichs did a big Christian gimmick, where wrestling was the product. The Von Erichs became 3 of the hottest babyfaces in wrestling, just as the Junkyard Dog did years earlier, due to having the right heel opposition. While several territories caught fire in 1983, which was a huge year nationwide for the business, 1 year before Vince McMahon went national with the WWF, World Class had the hottest program of them all. Various mixes of the feud were drawing 4,500 people every Friday night in Dallas at the decrepit Sportatorium, and the big shows, called Star Wars, were now selling out Reunion Arena's 18,000 seats. Suddenly David passed away in Japan from a drug overdose, but the territory was so hot, they introduced Mike Von Erich as a replacement. The 19-year-old, some would say, was the single least credible main eventer of the time, as he was rushed into the hottest programs in wrestling. Gordy and Roberts were so good as workers that they somehow got Mike over, and the territory didn't miss a beat. It peaked on May 6, 1984 when, underneath the famous Kerry title win over Flair in David's honor, Fritz and Mike and Kevin beat the Freebirds in a bad street match for the 6-man titles for 32,123 fans paying $402,000. At the time the second largest live gate in the history of North American pro wrestling, at Texas Stadium, one of the largest crowds in the history of pro wrestling until that point in time. Gordy had debuted for All Japan in August of 1983 when Bruiser Brody saw his potential, working several matches against him in Texas, most notably the tag match, Hayes and Gordy losing the American tag titles to Brody and Kerry, on June 17, 1983 at Reunion Arena. Brody recommended him to Giant Baba after working with him on the show, which drew 18,000 fans as the co-feature with the Flair vs. Kevin headliner. It was the building's first pro wrestling sellout and nearly doubling the previous state record gate set for the Christmas show just 6 months earlier. His first tour put him on the map in the biggest match in the promotion in several years, as the designated guy to do the job for Terry Funk's retirement match as Stan Hansen's tag team partner. He did so well that Japan ended up being his wrestling home for most of the next decade. Days before he was supposed to go for what may have been the highest profile match of his career, Gordy wanted to cancel, saying he didn't want to go to Japan or fly that far. Hayes had to talk him into going at the last minute. Gordy on occasion used the move now known as the powerbomb as a piledriver-like finish in the United States, although it didn't have a name. He debuted it on August 25, 1983 in Japan against Genichiro Tenryu, and it got over so big it eventually became his trademark and become by the late 80s the hot finishing move in Japan. His success in Japan ultimately broke up the original Freebird team. Hayes in 1989 reformed a Freebird team in WCW with Jimmy Garvin and managers Diamond Dallas Page and Humperdinck, a pairing most Freebird fans of the 80s would choose to forget. He went from being a guy scared to go out on his own, to Japan, to a guy who flourished on his own, Hayes said. We would never want to stop another from achieving success. When Vince McMahon went national in 1984 and tried to lock up the most marketable talent in the country to run against the established regional offices, the Freebirds would seemingly be high on his list of people to take. It's a forgotten chapter in wrestling history. Hayes, who already produced a music video with the help of the Crack production crew in Dallas, went to the WWF to become a rock star under the tutelage of Cyndi Lauper's manager, David Wolf. McMahon's idea was to create a rock band that would wrestle, and Hayes, with his love for music and his charisma in wrestling, was the most obvious choice. To say this was a flop would be an understatement. As wild as the wrestlers of that era were, they weren't ready for the Freebirds, who only lasted a few weeks. Gordy at the same time got a nearly full-time offer from Giant Baba, and was gone. We were young and cocky and it was a culture shock, remembered Hayes of the short-lived and forgotten stay. It was the typical WWF attitude. The Freebirds, coming off their success, felt they had nothing to prove going to the WWF as they were already stars. The WWF attitude was that what was done elsewhere didn't count. We didn't like it, Hayes recalled. Terry and Buddy really didn't like it. Dallas had already peaked. Same people for too long. It was really only designed as a promotional vehicle for the kids, and with the same baby faces, and many of the same heels running every Monday and Friday in the same metropolitan area, the territory never regained its 1983-84 peak. Freebirds did their face turns on each other, getting back together again for more Freebirds vs. Von Erichs, but the glory days were over. They went to Florida when Eddie Graham gave Hayes the book, but then Graham committed suicide and the territory wasn't doing business. They had a run in the AWA which led to a pretty hot drawing program with the Road Warriors, including a Comiskey Park show in Chicago that drew more than 20,000 fans, but Freebirds and Verne Gagne ultimately mixed like oil and water and the stay was short-lived. We drove everyone crazy, Hayes said. We even drove ourselves crazy. The Freebirds suggested doing the natural program with the Road Warriors, since they were, along with the Von Erichs, probably the most established main event tag teams in the business at the time. Verne Gagne was against it, thinking the Road Warriors were heels, even though almost all the fans were cheering them at the time. But the Freebirds programs with the other AWA babyfaces, whose heat was almost all killed by the Road Warriors, as heels not selling for the other faces, were cold and they hated the weather and got out. They ended up back in Texas. When Watts decided to follow the lead of McMahon and Jim Crockett and go national, particularly expanding into Texas, he and Booker Ken Lusk launched a full-scale raid of the Von Erich territory, taking many of the top stars, including the Freebirds, with popular valet Sunshine Valerie French as their manager. Lawsuits followed, but ultimately, the economy in Watts' territory was weak and wrestling was past its peak. Going national proved to be too expensive. For whatever reason, probably having worked too long in the same general part of the country and no longer being a fresh act, the Freebirds' drawing power wasn't there this time, although they had numerous great matches. By this point Gordy was considered one of the best in-ring performers in the business, and when Watts chose his first world champion to base his national company around, Gordy got the nod, beating top face Jim Duggan in the finals of a hot tournament on May 30, 1986 in Houston. Gordy was a tremendous champion in the ring, with classic matches against Duggan, Steve Williams, Ted DiBiase, Terry Taylor and others. At one point, when wrestling started changing and fans were losing patience with slow-building matches, Watts decided to fight the tide, ordering DiBiase, his best pure worker, and Gordy to do 55 minutes matches in every city, making the fans believe they were going to see the old 60 minutes Broadway. And then, when they were sure that was the finish, having Gordy use heel tactics to score a pinfall. The matches were classics, but the cost of signing all that talent, combined with weak gates partially due to a lack of fresh talent and also because the home base was hit hard by a recession due to the collapse of the oil business, and an expensive national syndication network which was costing big money in the major markets to maintain and wasn't generating enough ad revenue, it wasn't a winning formula. Going with Gordy as champion for most promoters was a decision they wouldn't have made because his Japanese commitments saw him frequently leave. With three of his top wrestlers, Gordy, Williams and DiBiase, all having heavy and lucrative Japanese deals, it was getting harder to build momentum of championship programs. There were just so many injury angles you could do with DiBiase and Williams before it started to get out of hand. Gordy ended up being injured legitimately in an auto accident that November, but was going to end up losing the title anyway, since Watts had a big Superdome show on Thanksgiving and Gordy was booked in Baba's tag team tournament, with former Dallas rival Killer Khan, he of the famous Battle of the Oriental Spike bloodbaths, at the same time. The injury forced Gordy to forfeit the title to one-man gang at a time when Watts decided to move the heat from what he felt were the more immature Freebirds to the more solid crew led by Skander Akbar, who they were more professional, totally lacked charisma, and the territory went down the tubes. In early 1987, Watts sold the Universal Wrestling Federation to Jim Crockett. For the most part, the original Freebirds were finished. When DiBiase signed with WWF to become the $1 Million Man, Gordy got his spot as Hansen's regular tag team partner, including winning the 1988 Real World Tag League Tournament over Genichiro Tenryu and Toshiaki Kawada in the match which made Kawada a superstar. Tenryu was injured and Kawada was by himself for several minutes against both the company's top foreigners, kicking out of one big move after another before finally losing in one of the all-time classic matches. His final big run in Texas took place 1 year earlier, the controversial Angle on December 25, 1987, 5 years to the day of them doing the Angle setting the company on fire. By this point both David and Mike Von Erich had passed away and an angle was shot where Gordy, Roberts, and King Parsons, known as the Blackbirds, turned on Fritz, then 59, and pounded on him until Fritz faked a heart attack and for the next several weeks, depending largely on the gate the previous Friday, pretended to be near either getting better after a sellout, or near death, when the houses started to drop. Even people in wrestling, who already had some major latitude when it came to angles, were repulsed by Fritz playing off the deaths of his two children for what was the last angle that actually drew money for the family as Kevin and Kerry went for revenge in early 1988. But Dallas was by this point just a stop between Japan tours for Gordy. In 1990, Baba, attempting to duplicate the success of the Hansen and Brody tag team of 1982-85, tried to recreate it with Gordy and Williams. Williams at the time was one of New Japan's top foreigners. Baba signed him as a regular through New Japan in a deal when, for a brief period, both sides worked together. From the start, Baba wanted to build the tag team division around them, and in their first major match on March 6, 1990 at Budokan Hall, they defeated the company's top foreign star, Hansen, and top native star, Tenryu, to win the World Tag Team titles. They dominated the belts for the next 3 years, including in 1990 and 1991 becoming the first tag team to win back-to-back Real World Tag League Tournament victories. Although not quite the force inside the ring he had been before the knee problems, Gordy at the time was still probably the best big man inside the ring in the business. He was being groomed for the top position in All Japan, with the aging Hansen being moved to that veteran gunslinger position, and toward that end, Pice held the Triple Crown in 1990. He first won it from Jumbo Tsuruta on June 5 in Chiba, just for a short run to heat up his feud with Hansen, who won the title 3 days later at Budokan Hall before 14,800 fans. The feud was designed to make fans see the younger Gordy as Hansen's equal while still protecting Hansen's legend, as Gordy was put on the same plane as Hansen 6 weeks later, winning the Triple Crown on June 17, 1990 in Kanazawa in 2104. At the time, this was one of the few times up to that point in the 13 years he had been the most popular foreign wrestler in Japan that Hansen had done a clean job for another foreigner. It was a transition period for All Japan, with Misawa replacing Tsuruta as the focal point of the company, with Tsuruta taking the old native gunslinger role that Baba took years earlier when Tsuruta was made the regular main event native, and similarly Gordy, from the same generation, would take the focal role on the foreigner side from Hansen, with the idea Misawa versus Gordy would be the legendary singles program of the 90s. But shortly after the win, while partying at Roppongi, a hot nightlife part of Tokyo, he collapsed at a club suffering from a major overdose. His heart stopped beating. He was revived, survived, and returned to the ring on the next tour with no discernible damage, but unfortunately, the scare didn't teach him the lesson it should have, as his lifestyle never changed. Baba stripped him of the title and he nearly lost his job in the process. Drugs, both painkillers and otherwise, were commonplace by this point among the foreigners in Japan, both to combat being in Japan for a month straight at times, as well as the pain from the matches. However, Baba, the beloved father figure and boss, came from another era and had little tolerance for them, or at least had adopted a see no evil attitude. The overdose forced Baba to have to see the issue, and it took a lot of pleading for him to allow Gordy back. But he never gave him the Triple Crown again, and never even allowed him to challenge for it until 3 years later, ironically, in a match that would never take place. Gordy and Williams were together only 3 years, but their total time holding the World Tag Team titles was longer than all but 9 teams in the history of pro wrestling. In Japan, they had classic battles with all the top tag teams of that hot era, including Hansen and Tenryu, Hansen and Danny Spivey Misawa, and Kawada the Funks, Giant Baba and Andre the Giant Jumbo Tsuruta, and Yoshiaki Yatsu Tsuruta, and Kabuki Tsuruta and Akira Tao, Doug Furness, and Dan Crawford Kawada and Tao, Misawa and Kobashi and Hansen and Gary Albright. This was during the period when All Japan hit one of its hot periods, ironically during a period when many thought the company would be crippled. Tenryu, who was the biggest star in the company at the time, quit, taking several veterans with them. The company was forced to make stars out of some of the younger wrestlers, who by Japanese tradition, would likely have had to have waited years of patience for their turn. The most experienced of the younger wrestlers was Tiger Mask, who they had unmasked as Misawa, and he suddenly caught fire, combined with strong pushes for Kobashi, Kawada, Tao and others. Later when Jun Akiyama debuted, he was pushed from the start. Business caught fire when Misawa first got over as a main eventer. Soon it got so hot they started selling out all tickets from rabid fans who would sell out Budokan as soon as tickets were put on sale at the show before. Gordy and Williams' first tag tournament win in 1990 came with a spectacular finish, when Williams, for the first time in his career, pinned Hansen, tag match against Hansen and Spivey, in 29:59 with the Oklahoma Stampede. The booking got them over huge, because Hansen and Spivey had more points going into the finals, a 30 minutes time limit match, and only needed to draw, which everyone expected when just a few minutes were left, to win the tournament. To relieve the pressure on his bad knees, Gordy trimmed down, getting as light as 245 pounds in 1991, which looked positively skinny on his broad frame. As drawing cards, the team peaked during the 1991 tournament, setting television ratings records that still stand in Japan on successive weeks in December of that year. In the 12:30 a.m. to 1:30 a.m. Sunday night time slot, Gordy and Williams' match with Hansen and Spivey was the main event on a show which drew a 7.0 rating, the largest rating in the history of that time slot in Japan. The record lasted only 1 week, as the tournament final, where they beat Misawa and Kawada, drew an 8.2. Part of this record was also because that was the Dynamite Kid retirement ceremony, both weeks doing better than a 75 audience share. What's even brought them back to WCW in 1992, where they held both the WCW and newly created NWO World Tag Team titles, working programs with both the Steiner brothers, which was an intriguing feud for Japan since the Steiners were top draws for New Japan while Gordy and Williams were the top foreigners for All Japan, and Dustin Rhodes and Barry Windham, but ultimately their stay was short due to Japan commitments and neither wanting to give up what in those days was considered one of the prime jobs in wrestling. That was Gordy's peak earning years, working 26 weeks for Baba at nearly $10,000 per week, plus another $200,000 WCW deal that Jim Ross and Watts put together for them. They held the All Japan World Tag Team titles 5 times over 3 years, including also holding both the NWA and WCW tag titles in the United States in 1992. They would have likely remained the dominant foreign team in All Japan for the rest of the decade. Terry Gordy, pro wrestling superstar, ended on August 18, 1993. At the age of 32, while flying to Japan for a tour, which was to climax with a show at Budokan Hall a few weeks later, where he would finally be allowed to main event on his own, challenging Misawa for the Triple Crown on a show that was already sold out. He took 50 somas on the flight. It was generally a known rule that Gordy would come to Japan 2 days before the tour started, and get so loaded on the long flight, that he'd spend a day sleeping it off in his Tokyo hotel room on arrival, and the wrestlers and his friends knew to just let him be. But this time, when the plane landed, he was out, and turning blue. While on the plane nobody reacted because he was always like that on the trip over. But this time he wasn't sleeping, he was in a coma. When they couldn't awaken him, EMTs got on the plane to perform CPR to attempt to revive him, and at one point, once again, his heart stopped beating and his brain stopped functioning. He was rushed to the hospital and remained in a coma for 5 days. He was never the same. That was a self-induced problem, Hayes said. I don't know if he didn't understand the success or couldn't handle the success. The overdose left him brain damaged and robbed him of his athletic ability. He had to relearn to talk, then relearn to walk, and eventually even relearn to wrestle, up to a point. He could no longer perform at a top level, but he still had a name and bills to pay, and he only knew one thing. He returned to wrestling several months later. He returned to wrestling in the dying days of the Global Wrestling Federation in Texas, joining Hayes and Jimmy Garvin as the Freebirds. With no advertising, advanced publicity, fanfare, or pressure, Baba brought him in for a series of mid-card matches starting with the 7th annual Bruiser Brody Memorial Show on July 16, 1994 in Nagasaki for a short run, but it was not a success. After finishing the tour on July 28, 1994 at Budokan Hull, he was never brought back to All Japan. Over the past 6 years he continued to wrestle, as a shadow of himself, mainly working small independent shows in the South or for the IWA in Japan, but tried to use the famous Terry Gordy name from his glory days on network television to sell tickets and booked him strong. As the 757 fans, and brief forays as champ in promotions on their last legs like the GWF in Dallas and Smoky Mountain Wrestling's somewhat high profile, desperate that his name might briefly inject some life into their sagging box office. He had later brief runs in ECW and finally, WWF, under a mask as Foley's short-lived tag team partner. I suppose if he hadn't have survived, he'd have been James Dean. Instead, he was Jan of Jan and Dean. People who knew his name and then saw him perform during this period, mainly were left feeling sad, remembering just how good he once was. Hayes said the last few years of Gordy's life were very tough on him. He said Gordy lost a lot of his drive when he realized he couldn't come all the way back. In his mind, I think it really bothered him that he'd never be that Terry Gordy again. It was only 8 years ago. But in this industry, that's several lifetimes. Just as fans today don't even know that Michael Hayes was ever a famous wrestler years ago when the new generation of wrestlers in the WWF dressing room would ask, incredulously, "You mean Doak Hendricks, Hayes' former name as a WWF announcer, used to wrestle?" The older wrestlers who knew what the Freebirds were in pro wrestling, or even the other younger wrestlers who grew up on Georgia or Texas wrestling, had to either cringe or try to hold their temper. But obviously that means Terry Gordy and the exploits of the Freebirds are long forgotten in a world which has no history other than what happens to fit in with the current storyline, aside from their near miss last year in the Hall of Fame balloting. Maybe that's good, because nobody remembers the Masked Executioner and Undertaker brawl outside that building 5 years ago as Undertaker thought he was working a program with the legendary Terry Gordy, only to find out by this time Terry Gordy was just a name. Like Dynamite Kid, so many of the great performers pushed themselves so hard, at both ends of the candle, which led to a physical explosion. Aside from the memories of fans from that time period, when the story was over, Dynamite Kid came to Calgary with $20 in his pocket. He returned home to England for the last time almost 2 decades later after being one of the greatest in-ring performers of all time, leaving remnants of his crippled body in rings around the world. Financially, he had broken even. With all the success he had early in life, Gordy left his family with little, and had no life insurance. More than 300 people attended Gordy's funeral in Rossville, Georgia on July 19. Lots of indie wrestlers. Hayes was there, of course. Roberts was at the wake the night before. Other stars of the same era like Terry Taylor, Tommy Rich, Tony Anthony, whose name as the Dirty White Boy was actually something Gordy came up with for himself in Alabama, Doug Gilbert and Robert Gibson, as well as Barry Buchanan of the WWF, attended along with a slew of local independent wrestlers who saw Gordy as the one wrestler out of Chattanooga who for a period of time was, no matter how the story ended, he was a local legend in the ring. Minister Richard Hutchison talked about how everyone in town used to watch Terry Gordy on Saturdays at 6 p.m. Georgia Championship Wrestling. He talked about how tough this must be on Hayes, who was with Gordy's family. Gordy was shown in an open casket, and even with a heavy makeup they weren't able to cover up his massive gig marks from 2 decades of blade jobs as one of his other noted talents in the ring, as seems to be the case with a lot of wrestlers who were heavy drinkers, as he was a tremendous bleeder. He left behind 3 children from a previous marriage, a son Terry Ray Jr., the same Ray who was the subject of a 1981 angle where Hayes, by this point a babyface, gave Gordy's son a present which Gordy destroyed on Atlanta TV, attempting to follow in his father's big footsteps wrestling in Japan, and 2 young girls. The song Free Bird played at the service. Behind the casket in the chapel was a giant wreath of white flowers, with red flowers that also spelled out Free Bird with 2 small rebel flags. Hayes missed one of his weekly syndicated announcing gigs for the funeral, but did the other and briefly mention Gordy, which was the only WWF mention of him, and thanked people who had sent him their condolences during the week. He will come out of retirement to fulfill Gordy's final wrestling commitment on August 11th for a Southeastern Wrestling reunion show in Birmingham by teaming with Gordy's son in a show billed as Last One for the Road, a tribute to Free Bird Terry Gordy. While the last few years for him was sad, being unable to perform at anywhere near the level he used to or live up to the name, or have the fans see him as the same person, his final experience in wrestling apparently wasn't. As noted last week, Gordy came to the WWF SmackDown tapings in Birmingham just 6 days before he died. The WWF had run many major shows in the Birmingham market over the last few years, and he never attended any of them. In the last year, mentally, he'd made great improvements. His eyes were clear and he was totally coherent. Many of the biggest names in wrestling, including the McMahon family and The Undertaker, Dudleys, Rob Van Dam, Big Show, Jim Ross, Gerald Briscoe and others came up to him and told him that they remembered what he'd accomplished. Some of the younger wrestlers who grew up watching him told him what an honor it was to meet him. "When we left the building, Terry told me he would never go to another show like that," said longtime friend Michael Holt, who came to the show with him. "God knew this was it," said Hayes. "I'm just glad he had that day." Terry Gordy. Career title history. Source: Wrestling Title History's 3rd edition and Wrestling Observer newsletter records. All Japan Triple Crown defeated Jumbo Tsuruta June 5, 1990. Chiba lost to Stan Hansen June 8, 1990. Tokyo defeated Stan Hansen July 17, 1990. Ishikawa title vacated when Gordy missed title defense due to overdose. Universal Wrestling Federation Heavyweight won tournament to create first champion over Jim Duggan May 30, 1986. Houston title vacated when Gordy was injured in an auto accident November 19, 1986. All Japan Double World Tag Team with Stan Hansen defeated Jumbo Tsuruta and Yoshiaki Yatsu July 29, 1988. Takasaki lost to Jumbo Tsuruta and Yoshiaki Yatsu July 31, 1988. Hakodate with Stan Hansen won vacant title in Annual World Tag League Tournament defeated Genichiro Tenryu and Toshiaki Kawada December 13, 1988. Tokyo lost to Jumbo Tsuruta and Yoshiaki Yatsu February 2, 1989. Kansas City with Steve Williams defeated Stan Hansen and Genichiro Tenryu March 6, 1990. Tokyo lost to Jumbo Tsuruta and Great Kabuki July 19, 1990. Tokyo with Steve Williams won vacant title in Annual World Tag League Tournament defeated Stan Hansen and Danny Spivey December 7, 1990. Tokyo lost to Stan Hansen and Danny Spivey April 18, 1991. Tokyo with Steve Williams defeated Stan Hansen and Danny Spivey June 6, 1991. Yokosuka lost to Mitsuharu Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada July 24, 1991. Kanazawa with Steve Williams won vacant title in Annual World Tag League Tournament defeated Mitsuharu Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada December 6, 1991. Lost to Jumbo Tsuruta and Akira Tao March 4, 1992. Tokyo with Steve Williams defeated Mitsuharu Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada January 30, 1993. Chiba lost to Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao May 20, 1993. Sapporo WCW World Tag Team with Steve Williams defeated Rick and Scott Steiner July 5, 1992. Atlanta lost to Dustin Rhodes and Barry Windham September 21, 1992. Atlanta NWO World Tag Team with Steve Williams won tournament final to create champions defeated Dustin Rhodes and Barry Windham July 16, 1992. Albany, Georgia lost to Dustin Rhodes and Barry Windham September 21, 1992. Atlanta NWO American Heavyweight defeated Kevin Von Erich January 21, 1983. Dallas lost to Kevin Von Erich March 4, 1983. Dallas World Class 6-Man Tag Team with David Von Erich and Michael Hayes defeated Bill Irwin and Great Kabuki and the Mongol, Gene Pettit, December 25, 1982. Dallas David Von Erich vacated title to Buddy Roberts after the match, lost to Kevin and Kerry and David Von Erich July 4, 1983. Fort Worth with Michael Hayes and Buddy Roberts defeated Kevin and Kerry and David Von Erich August 12, 1983. Dallas lost to Kevin and Kerry and David Von Erich December 2, 1983. Dallas with Michael Hayes and Buddy Roberts defeated Kevin and Kerry and David Von Erich in fictitious match in Georgia, lost to Fritz and Kevin and Mike Von Erich May 6, 1984. Irving, Texas defeated Kevin and Kerry and Mike Von Erich July 4, 1984. Fort Worth lost to Kevin and Kerry and Mike Von Erich September 3, 1984. Fort Worth defeated Kevin and Kerry Von Erich and Brian Adias January 3, 1986. Dallas lost to Kevin and Kerry and Lance Von Erich May 4, 1986. Irving, Texas with Buddy Roberts and King Parsons defeated Steve Simpson and Chris Adams and Matt Bourne January 4, 1988. Dallas Gordy vacated his third of title leaving for Japan. NWA National Tag Team with Buddy Roberts and sometimes Michael Hayes defeated Robert Fuller and Stan Frazier in traditional Thanksgiving Tag Team Tournament Final November 27, 1980. Atlanta to become first champions, lost to Ted DiBiase and Stan Frazier January 26, 1981. Augusta, Georgia with Buddy Roberts and sometimes Michael Hayes defeated Ted DiBiase and Stan Frazier January 31, 1981. Atlanta lost to Ted DiBiase and Steve Olsanowski June 10, 1981. Marietta, Georgia with Jimmy Snuka defeated Ted DiBiase and Steve Olszanowski July 6, 1981 Augusta, Georgia, lost to Michael Hayes and Otis Sistering September 27, 1981 Atlanta, with Michael Hayes defeated Super Destroyer and John Studd July 2, 1982 Chattanooga, lost to Afa and Sega August 29, 1982 Atlanta. NWA Georgia Tag Team with Buddy Roberts, and sometimes Michael Hayes won 3-team tournament over Mr. Wrestling 1 and 2 in the Masked Assassins October 10, 1980 Atlanta, titles held up after match with Kevin Sullivan and Austin Idol November 14, 1980 Atlanta. Mid-South Tag Team, with Michael Hayes defeated Bill Watts and Buck Robley November 24, 1979 Shreveport, lost to Junkyard Dog and Buck Robley April 6, 1980 Monroe, Louisiana, with Buddy Roberts defeated Junkyard Dog and Buck Robley June 9, 1980 New Orleans, lost to Junkyard Dog and Terry Orndorff September 1980. NWA American Tag Team, with Michael Hayes defeated Bill Irwin and King Kong Bundy November 26, 1982 Dallas, lost to Kerry Von Erich and Bruiser Brody June 17, 1983 Dallas. Mid-South Louisiana Heavyweight defeated Junkyard Dog May 2, 1980 Shreveport, lost to Junkyard Dog 1980. NWA Mid-American Tag Team, with Michael Hayes defeated George Gulas and Bobby Eaton January 7, 1979 Chattanooga, lost to Bobby Eaton and Mexican Angel February 1979, with Michael Hayes defeated Bobby Eaton and Mexican Angel February 1979, lost to Gypsy Joe and Tom Renisto Jr. July 4, 1979 Nashville. Global Wrestling Tag Team, with Jimmy Garvin defeated Black Bart and John Hawk Bradshaw, June 3, 1994 Dallas, promotion folded in September. NWA Southeastern Heavyweight defeated Jos LeDuc 1982 Dothan, Alabama, lost to Jos LeDuc 1982. NWA Alabama Heavyweight defeated Jimmy Golden 1982, lost to Jos LeDuc May 1982. Mississippi Heavyweight held title in 1978, lost to Dr. X July 1978. Smoky Mountain Heavyweight won title in tag match with Thrasher over champ Brad Armstrong and Wolfman October 20, 1995 Knoxville, lost to Brad Armstrong November 23, 1995 Knoxville. Champion Carnival Tournament record. 1992 4th place behind Stan Hansen, Mitsuharu Misawa and Jumbo Tsuruta. 1993 tied for 3rd behind Stan Hansen and Mitsuharu Misawa. Real World Tag League Tournament history. 1986 with Killer Khan, 5th. 1987 with Stan Hansen, tied for 2nd behind Jumbo Tsuruta and Yoshiaki Yatsu. 1988 with Stan Hansen defeated Genichiro Tenryu and Toshiaki Kawada to win. 1989 with Bill Irwin, 7th. 1990 with Steve Williams defeated Stan Hansen and Danny Spivey to win. 1991 with Steve Williams defeated Mitsuharu Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada to win. 1992 with Steve Williams, tied for 2nd behind Mitsuharu Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada. Wrestling Observer Newsletter Awards. Tag Team of the Year. 1980 with Buddy Roberts. 1981 with Jimmy Snuka. 1992 with Steve Williams. Best Brawler. 1986 winner. Match of the Year. 1984 with Michael Hayes and Buddy Roberts vs. Kevin and Kerry and Mike Von Erich July 4, Fort Worth. Feud of the Year. 1983 with Michael Hayes and Buddy Roberts vs. Kevin and Kerry and David Von Erich. 1984 with Michael Hayes and Buddy Roberts vs. Kevin and Kerry and Mike Von Erich. The booking in New Japan has been questionable for much of the past few years, but the July 20th show at the Sapporo Dome was the most perplexing to date. The show was built around the idea of New Japan wrestlers facing a variety of outsiders in 7 of the 10 scheduled matches. The outsiders won 6 of the 7 matches. It's good to keep programs alive to keep outsiders strong rather than beating them the first time out, but even more importantly, the home team needs to be also kept strong or you destroy your brand. How many people came here to see WCW? Due to an unforeseen accident changing one finish at the company's June 6 pay-per-view show, they were coming off a show where they did a best of 5 with All Japan on their own show and lost 4 of the 5. In follow-up booking that would have made the defunct company that collapsed in almost record time proud, New Japan, on the biggest pro wrestling event ever in Sapporo, weakened the company even more. Despite putting on what most were calling a good to great show, they followed the pattern of such booking that has gone on for several months. The show drew an announced 28,000 fans, with a gate that likely topped $2 million, for the first wrestling show ever in the 52,000-seat building, which was easily the largest wrestling crowd ever in the city. Most, but not all, were happy with the turnout. which was also held as a live 2-hour television special from 3 to 5 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, a national holiday, Marine Day. The show drew a 6.2 rating in that time slot, which was a disappointment, and seems to indicate just how strong a ratings draw Naoya Ogawa, who wasn't on the show, is for New Japan big shows. Even more disappointing is that the rating peaked with at 8.5 for the Mark Coleman vs. Yuji Nagata match, which started at about 4 p.m., which means people were turning the show off after this match and they didn't come back during the second hour before what were billed as the big matches still upcoming, some of which didn't air anyway. The special wound up leaving a lot of furious viewers. The TV time expired about 1 minute into the semi-main event, Keiji Muto vs. Masahiro Chono. The Kazuyuki Fujita vs. Don Frye IWGP title match never aired, likely will air on television next week. Many of the interpromotional losses did make sense as standalone results. Geto and Jado winning the IWGP Junior Tag titles from Jushin Liger and El Samurai fit that bill. I'm not sure Masayuki Naruse winning the IWGP Junior title from Minoru Tanaka does, although it at least does establish Naruse, formerly with Rings who New Japan signed after Rings fired him due to money problems, as an important player and give him a spot at first, so even that makes sense. Certainly Coleman had to beat Nagata because there are big money matches on the horizon for Coleman, plus it's not time for Pride's World Heavyweight Champion to do a job in a pro wrestling ring and Nagata isn't the guy. However, Nagata has lost so often when in big matches that he desperately needs a big win to keep him as a serious player. Frye, a New Japan regular, losing to Fujita, who came into the match at a whopping 281 pounds. When he first made his name in shooting with his wins over Mark Kerr and Ken Shamrock, he was about 245. Also made sense as Fujita is being built for a Tokyo Dome Pride match with Coleman in November. Then there was Manabu Nakanishi vs. Gary Goodridge. Nakanishi was one of former booker Riki Choshu's choices to be the new big star. While not a good worker, his big moves are over, he's got size, and as a 1992 Olympic Games competitor in wrestling, he had that reality aura that helps a lot in Japan. Goodridge, who has a great look, great personality and great charisma for pro wrestling, is an undercard Pride fighter in only his second or third, depending upon what you consider his Pride match with Naoya Ogawa to fall into the category of pro match. Although he scored the win in the main event at the Fukuoka Dome show on May 5, Nakanishi looked bad in the process as Ogawa and Kazunari Murakami were uncooperative with him. They were able to avoid his takedowns, wouldn't sell for his pro wrestling offense, and exposed he had nothing standing. He badly needed a win against a shooter, and while on paper this was a bad wrestling match, because Nakanishi isn't good enough to carry a green guy, it, with the right finish, would be a good win that he needed at this point in time. I guess the idea was instead to use Nakanishi as a stepping stone to set up a Kazuyuki Fujita vs. Goodridge match down the line, but I just don't think it's a good idea to build Goodridge up right now to that level in New Japan because he wasn't a main eventer in Pride. It's like saying anyone from Pride who was a .500 fighter can come into New Japan and beat our top guys and get a title shot because those guys are the real tough guys and the only guys we have who can handle them are their own guys who also fight here on big shows like Fujita. That's great for making Pride to be number one, but an interpromotional angle should be a win-win style booking and you don't want to portray yourself as not being number one to your home fan base. The only win New Japan got over outsiders was the tag team champions, Satoshi Kojima and Hiroyoshi Tenzan, on the one-year anniversary of them winning the titles, in Sapporo from Nagata and Nakanishi, beating outsiders, although they were pro wrestling outsiders as opposed to shoot world outsiders, in All Japan's Taiyo Kiya and Michinoku Pro's Jinsei Shinzaki, both of whom often appear as guest stars on New Japan house shows. The problem with this booking is how it kills the house shows and weekly television shows when the regular headliners who work every night constantly lose to outsiders on the big shows. New Japan got over for years on the idea that New Japan wrestlers, with Antonio Inoki as the prime face of the company, were the most superior fighting athletes in the world. They protected that by often bringing in stars from other sports, who would sometimes get wins, but ultimately would have a big money loss to a New Japan guy. Somehow over the last 2 years the theme has instead been that New Japan guys never get their wins back, and ultimately the top guys in the company that work the house shows nightly, and thus the company itself, are weakened. If you look at who the big draws are, Shinya Hashimoto is now with 0-1. He was hurt never getting a win back from Ogawa. Masahiro Chono and Keiji Muto are both injured and don't work nightly but are the main draws on the road along with Riki Choshu, who also doesn't work nightly and is almost 50. Kensuke Sasaki has disappeared, and Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi have been hurt badly. Satoshi Kojima and Hiroyoshi Tenzan are a great team, but like Nagata have never gotten that big singles win over a top name. More so with its annual G1 Climax tournament upcoming from August 4th to August 12th, their world champion is an outsider, and not even in the tournament. Of those who are full-time regulars and in the tournament, only Kojima and Tenzan won on the show. Liger lost in a tag match, which again, was okay, since the people he lost to he's doing a program with. Tanaka, going into a G1 tournament where he'll likely be jobbed out as a junior heavyweight against heavyweights, is coming off high-profile losses to Masahito Kakihara of All Japan and Naruse, who is considered right now from rings even though he's really New Japan, neither of whom is in the tournament. Ditto Nakanishi and Nagata losing to outsiders who aren't in the tournament. So instead of it being the annual tournament to match up all the top wrestlers to determine a claimant to the #1 wrestler in Japan, G1, which for the first time last year had difficulty selling tickets, comes across like a crew of guys who can't beat guys from Pride, Rings or even the top guy from All Japan, all trying to redeem themselves against the guys they always face, who also can't beat the guys from Pride and Rings, or the top guy from All Japan. We should have a report on matches 4 through 8 in next week's issue after watching the television. 1. Hiro Saito and Tatsutoshi Goto and Akira Nagami Saiki defeated Yutaka Yoshi and Osamu Nishimura and Shiro Koshinaka in 1352 when Goto gave Yoshi his back suplex. Akira used a splash off the top, and Saito followed scoring a pin after a senton on Yoshi. This shows just how far Yoshi has fallen as they were grooming him to be in the top mix just a few months ago. 2. Tadao Yasuda beat Michiyoshi Ohara in 6:14 with a front guillotine. Yasuda is now an Inoki/Pride guy, while the entire last tour New Japan tried to get Ohara over doing a shooter gimmick. Work shoot style and said to be a good match. Ohara, the New Japan guy, lost to his own finishing move. 3. Riki Choshu, Mitsuo Yoshida Kwak, and Tatsumi Fujinami and Osamu Kido beat Hiroshi Tanahashi and Kenzo Suzuki and Shinya Makabe in 10:43. This was basically the older veterans giving the young wrestlers a chance. Nobody expected the young guys to win, and it was just their role to show fire. It was billed as Kido's final match ever in Sapporo, as he's retiring at the end of the year and he's from the area, so he got a huge pop coming out and was more of the focus of this match than he's been in a long time. Kido used the Wakigatami, Fujiwara armbar, for the submission on Tanahashi. 4. The live TV started out with Geto, Kiri Takayama, and Jado, Shoji Akiyoshi winning the IWGP Junior Tag titles from Jushin Liger, Keiichi Yamada, and El Samurai Osamu Matsuda, in 1906 when Jado used the Benoit crossface submission on Samurai. Most reports had this as a good, but not great match. 5. Masayuki Naruse won the IWGP Junior title from Minoru Tanaka in 11:27. This was Naruse's first match in New Japan, so it does make sense to put the exclamation point behind him. Lots of hard kicks back and forth. Naruse scored the pin after a spinning backfist. This was mainly mat work and hard kicks, with no acrobatics, which is what fans would want for New Japan versus Rings, since Naruse is associated with Rings since he worked his whole career there. 6. Gary Goodridge beat Manabu Nakanishi via referee stoppage in 6:06. Nakanishi didn't wear gloves. Goodridge threw a lot of punches early and got a mount position. Nakanishi bucked Goodridge off and speared him outside the ring and went for a Boston Crab. Goodridge made the ropes. Nakanishi did 2 more spears, but on the third attempt, Goodridge caught him with an uppercut to the chin, which Nakanishi sold as a knockout and the ref stopped the match. Got mixed reports on this one. Hard to believe it could be good. 7. Mark Coleman beat Yuji Nagata in 7:59. Coleman blew out his left knee in training, but still did the match. This ended up working out good for Nagata, who was going to have to do the job. But at least he saved face by giving Coleman the storyline injury that may keep him out of the July 29th Pride show. Gary Goodridge will replace Coleman against Rings tournament winner Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. Nagata did a lot of low kicks and an ankle lock early, which allowed Coleman to sell the leg. Both men wore gloves. Coleman came back winning with a power bomb and a Kesagatami, which is basically a cranking headlock submission that he used to win the UFC heavyweight title for the first time in 1997 from Dan Severn. Said to be good, with some reports having it as the best match on the show. These two worked real good together on New Year's Eve. Coleman has natural aptitude for this business and Nagata is one of the best, and he's perfect for this work shoot style based on moves and positions popularized in Pride as his pay-per-view match with Kazuyuki Fujita showed. 8. Hiroyoshi Tenzan, Kim Kill Choi, and Satoshi Kojima remained the longest-reigning IWGP Tag Team Champions in history on their one-year anniversary, beating Taiokiya, Manukiya Mossman, and Jinsei Kensuke Shinzaki, in 1628 when Tenzan pinned Shinzaki after a moonsault after a lariat by Kojima. Mixed reports on this match. Told it was a disappointment with some great moves and some messed up moves. 9. Masahiro Chono beat Keiji Muto in 1609 with the STF. Muto mainly did low drop kicks and Chono did the Yakuza kick. This result makes booking sense to a degree if it builds up a Triple Crown title match between the two where Muto goes over. Still, it represents a first for Motoko Baba with their old school mentality about world titles. It is the first time an All Japan World Champion has done a clean job while holding the title on someone else's soil and to a non-All Japan contender being set up for a title match. With the way Japan has been booked of late, with so many programs with top people being set up and never followed through on, you just can't be sure. Muto did his usual spots built around the dragon screw. Chono actually did a plancha. He sold his stomach since everyone knows about his intestinal problems. Finish saw Muto go for a second Shining Wizard knee to the head, but Chono blocked it, hit a Yakuza kick and did the STF for the finish. Said to be good. Muto has pulled off some miracles of late, so I guess it's possible. But hard to imagine Chono working that long a singles match in his condition and it being any good. 10. Kazuyuki Fujita retained the IWGP Heavyweight title, beating Don Frye via submission with a front guillotine in 7:22. Another work shoot match involving two people who have star credentials in the shoot world, but again, a loss for the New Japan regular, although expected since Fujita is getting the Goldberg treatment. Started with wrestling, then traded punching. Fujita blocked Frye's takedown and threw him around before using the finisher for the tap. Both men shook hands after the match. Said to have been a good main event. Barbara Balabar Strauss, the trustee in the ECW bankruptcy case, last week hired General Counsel Serchuk and Zelamir of White Plains, New York to attempt to facilitate sale of the estate to the World Wrestling Federation. In papers filed this past week, counsel has been retained to investigate claims regarding Inodius Incorporated's interest in ECW as well as the apparent trademark infringements that have occurred. Balabar Strauss wrote that general counsel is necessary to assist the trustee with investigations of ECW's business transactions and assets, as well as unauthorized use and/or concealment of assets, and to prosecute fraudulent conveyance matters. That is actually standard bankruptcy practice to investigate these things, so may not be as ominous as it sounds. She also requested an extension in her power to investigate the case through December 18, 2001, which will go before U.S. bankruptcy judge Adlai Hardin Jr. on August 6. According to her petition, she was conferred with Paul Heyman's attorney regarding turning over his books and records and served him with a written request to appear, but to date, he has not turned over the records. Not appeared. A meeting of creditors is scheduled for August 2, 3 days after Heyman has been ordered to appear before her for examination. Balabar Strauss' powers to handle the case expire, without the extension, on August 20. Heyman himself declared personal bankruptcy on June 22, something that was not unexpected. Heyman claimed $2,830,385.74 in debts at the filing, claiming he was owed $128,000 in unpaid wages from HHG. This raised the ire of some creditors who had been told Heyman never took a salary in running ECW. Most of the creditors listed were duplicates of creditors already listed in the HHG bankruptcy case. In the filing, Heyman listed his current employer at WWFE as a television writer, claiming a salary of $4,000 per month. Raw on July 23 drew a 5.35 rating, 4.94 first hour, 5.71 second hour, and an 8.6 share, which translates into about 6.95 million viewers. It was the fifth highest rated Raw of the year, and represents an amazing 31% increase in viewership since the show bottomed out on June 11, which the majority of which can be attributed to the interpromotional angle. The show started out strong, with a 4.50 first quarter with Austin's interview after joining with the Confederacy, and the audience grew consistently, with no down spots. No huge growth spots, with the biggest quarter-hour growth being 390,000 additional viewers for The Undertaker vs. Rhino match, 5.51, and 461,000 added viewers over 2 quarters for the main event, which did a 6.07 overrun after a 5.79 final quarter. It was the highest-rated match on any WWF program since The Rock vs. Austin cage match the day after WrestleMania did a 6.42. The show did a phenomenal 9.7 rating among males 12 to 17, which was the prime audience the company had lost during its downturn, up from a 6.1 the previous week, although it had a big drop among women 18 to 24 from 3.4 to 2.5. The return of Rock can't be credited for these numbers because the show was already off to a big start before Vince did the interview teasing his return, and opened huge before Austin threw his name out there as well. The tease of Rock's return will be the main factor if there is a big increase next week. This increase has to be credited to curiosity over Austin, and it should be noted that the highest rated Raw of the year, the day after Mania, was also after Austin did the turn based on that same curiosity, and it went into the rapid decline immediately. This time with Rock coming back, there is no reason for that to hold true, but only time will tell. SmackDown on July 19th drew a 3.94 rating, 4.52 realistic rating, and 7 share, a number almost identical with the previous week, or about 6.4 million viewers. For whatever reason, the invasion angle hasn't had the same effect on the SmackDown number as it has on the Raw numbers. But SmackDown also hasn't taken nearly the hit from the previous year that Raw did. It seems based on this that SmackDown was a loyal weekly following while Raw has a larger audience that comes and goes. UPN finished its usual 4th out of the 6 networks with NBC, which owned Thursday seemingly since the beginning of time, scarily, the next target, in 3rd place only doing a 5.7 for the night. Tough Enough on July 19th did a 2.27 rating, its best, by a slight margin to date. That show also continues to draw a consistent number. Weekend numbers for July 21st, July 22nd were Livewire at 0.73, Superstars at 0.90 and Heat at 1.67. Television Lucha Libre on July 17th drew a 2.4 rating, which is doubly impressive because the show aired from 9:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m., starting 90 minutes later than its former regular start time. The show on July 24th started in its new regular time slot of 7 to 10 p.m. Pro Wrestling Noah. Estimated average attendance June 1, 2,795. May 2001, 2,640. Estimated average gate June 1, $95,865. May 2001, $106,875. Percentage of house shows sold out June 1, 60.0. May 2001, 37.5. Average television rating June 1, 2.60. May 2001, 1.43. Mexico. The first Sunday show at Arena Mexico is July 29th and looks to be one of the deepest shows of the year, headlined by the Villano 3 vs. El Signo hair match, which has been the focal point of much of the Arena Mexico Friday night TV tapings. Also, La Parca and Super Parca debut at Arena Mexico, teaming with Brazo de Plata vs. Apollo Dantes and Mascara Ano 2000 and Cien Caras. The return of El Hijo del Santo and El Hijo de Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Lismark Jr. vs. Ultimo Guerrero and Rey Bucanero and Zumbido. Mr. Niebla and Safari and Olympico defend the Mexican national trios titles versus Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. and Emilio Charles Jr. Felino and Tony Rivera and Ricky Marvin vs. Virus and Dr. X and Archangel, and the Minis open with Suki, Max Mini, and Ultimo Dragon Cheeto and Ciclin Cheeto Ramirez vs. Pierre Otito and Torito and Fire. Rayo de Jalisco Jr. is saying that he wants a masked match with Universo 2000, and if he doesn't win, he'll retire. July 20th Arena Mexico TV taping was headlined by Villano 3 and Lismark Jr. and El Hijo de Rayo over Dr. Wagner Jr. and El Signo and Apollo Dantes when a mysterious masked man showed up, but Villano 4 stopped him from interfering and V3 scored the clean pin on Signo. EMLL has one of its strongest shows on paper on July 27th with Mr. Niebla and Negro Casas, and Santo vs. Blue Panther and Black Warrior and Shocker, El Satanico and Averno and Fuerza Guerrera vs. Rey Bucanero and Ultimo Guerrero and Mascara Magica, Safari and Antifaz del Norte and Ricky Marvin vs. Virus and Violencia and Poder Boricua as the top matches. This airs in the US on August 7th, and may be one to go out of the way to see. Only thing I heard about the July 20th show in Tijuana, headlined by Rayo and Mil Mascaras and Vampiro vs. Universo 2000 and Black Magic and Emilio Charles Jr., is that the show drew 2,500 fans, and it stunk. July 27th is Promociones BC with Halloween and Damien and Rey Mysterio vs. Scorpio Jr. and Emilio Charles Jr. and Bestia Salvaje in a ladder match, a three-way for the Tijuana Cup with La Parca and Nicho vs. Blue Demon Jr. and Black Tiger vs. El Hijo de Rayo and Brazo de Plata plus Minisoc Taganchito and Mascara de Sagrada 2000 vs. Piratita Morgan and Pierre Otito. Conan not being on the show seems to validate last week's story that EMLL promoter Paco Alonso managed to ice him by letting all the Tijuana promoters know that if they use him, they won't be able to use any EMLL talent. Pero Aguayo Jr. has a hair versus mask match against Panther next month in Monterrey, Puerto Rico. IWA's Apocalypses tour with several WWF names has the following main matches. July 26th in Guayama has Nuevo Gran Apollo vs DDP for the IWA title, Victor the Bodyguard and Ricky Banderas vs Tiger Ali Singh and Dutch Mantle in a street fight, Miguel Perez and Huracan Castillo Jr. vs D'Lo Brown and Chaz with lots of objects, Big Show and Shane vs Test and Russ McCulloch, New Yorkin, Angel of the ECW Baldies vs Crash Holly for the Hardcore title, Super Crazy vs Andy Anderson for IWA Junior Belt and Godfather, under that name, vs Sarooks. July 27th in Bayamon has Apollo and Banderas vs DDP and McCulloch, Victor vs Mantle, Perez and Castillo vs Brown and Chaz in a stretcher match, Test vs Singh, plus Show and Godfather in prelims. July 28th in Guillermo has Apollo vs DDP for IWA belt, Victor vs Mantle in a loser leaves town cage match with Chicky Star as ref, Perez and Castillo vs Brown and Chaz for IWA tag titles in a TLC match, Shane vs Test, Banderas vs Singh, Show vs McCulloch, Crazy vs Crash vs Anderson in three-way for IWA Junior Belt, Godfather vs Zarooks. Crazy won the IWA Hardcore title from Zarooks on July 21st in Levittown, but due to the 24/7 rule, was then attacked by New Yorkin, Angel of the ECW Baldies, and pinned for a second switch. All Japan. With everything down for a few weeks, the only angle is that Genichiro Tenryu said he was going to bring back one of his former employees from the defunct War promotion to be his tag team partner in a program with Taiyo Kiya and Masa Fuchi on the next show, which is the Fan Appreciation Show on August 19th at Korakuen Hall. Best bet is Koto Fuyuki. If the New Japan relationship falls apart, they'll focus on All Japan vs. War led by Tenryu in a worked interpromotional angle. Next full tour starts August 26th. Pro Wrestling Noah. Shinya Hashimoto is supposed to attend the July 27th Budokan Hall show to perhaps reopen a working agreement with this group N01. Jun Akiyama announced that he wanted the main event on that show, where he challenges Mitsuharu Misawa for the GHC belt, to be pinfalls only, with no submissions. Strange from a storyline deal since Akiyama's front guillotine is his main finisher, or referee stoppage. He said it's better for the fans, but to me, any elimination of an element takes an element away from working, particularly when fans expect a classic match going in and won't be happy with less. It was announced that Terry Gordy's son, who will wrestle as Terry Bam Bam Gordy Jr., real name Terry Raymond Gordy Jr., although he has previously wrestled as Ray Gordy, will debut on the August tour. He'll be more of a Japanese trainee than a foreign import. They had a TV special showing Misawa's trip to the U.S. to scout talent in Tennessee, Missouri, and California. They showed clips of a lot of indie guys in matches, held in gyms with only the wrestlers as spectators and an expressionless Misawa. It mostly looked like guys rushing through spot after spot, particularly in Tennessee, with the trainers including former All Japan star Richard Slinger, who is Gordy's nephew, telling them to slow down. You saw wrestler after wrestler who didn't have the WWF look, working their asses off, figuring this is probably one of the few career breaks they may have. The only time Misawa showed expression was smiling and clapping at the end of a Michael Modest vs. Donovan Morgan match, which from what aired, looked to be tremendous. The other standouts from the clips were Christopher Daniels, who may not have a shot here since he's a regular for Michinoku Pro, and Gordy's son, who has improved greatly since the last time I saw him wrestle when he was in Memphis. While much smaller than his father, he is very athletic in the ring. Kenta Kobayashi returned from an injury on July 18th with a new ring name, to avoid the obvious confusion since his name is so similar to the company's second biggest star. So to avoid the confusion, his new name is simply Kenta. Sometimes I get headaches. The biggest show of the week was July 22nd in Hiroshima before 3,600 with Misawa and Takuma Sano over Jun Akiyama and Akitoshi Saito when Misawa pinned Akiyama in 9:26 with the Emerald Frasian. Based on the usual Japanese booking patterns, when the challenger gets pinned by the champion before the biggest match of the year in a tag, which is the opposite of what would make sense to heighten interest in the singles match, one would suspect title change coming with Akiyama taking the GHC title on July 27th. Modest is said to be doing the best of the newcomers on this tour, which probably surprises nobody. Misawa has told People this past week that he wants Modest as a full-timer and Modest hasn't been asked to put anyone over the entire tour. Rookie Takashi Sugawara got a singles match with Misawa on the July 21st show in Hakata, losing of course, which is considered a big deal this early in his career. New Japan. Bam Bam Bigelow will return to New Japan for the first time since 1992 on a tour where they will have a foreigners version of the G1 Climax tournament called G1 World from starting on September 7th with the championship match taking place on September 16th in Nagoya, which is also the company's next pay-per-view show. Entered are Bigelow, Scott Hall, Scott Norton, Don Fry, Ryan Johnston and Super J. The winner of this tournament will meet the winner of the G1 Climax tournament in August, only Japanese members, to decide the top wrestler of the summer, probably on September 23rd in Osaka. The winner of that match faces Kazuyuki Fujita for the IWGP title on October 8th at the Tokyo Dome. Also on the tour will be Silver King and Dr. Wagner Jr. Bigelow was a huge star with this company from 1987 to 1992, excluding his first WWF tour in between, and was actually given a monster push his first year with singles wins over Akira Maeda. I believe he was the only foreigner ever put over Maeda after 1986 in New Japan, and Tatsumi Fujinami, and was one of Antonio Inoki's main foreign rivals early on. Fujita on July 21st talked about going on a several-day fast to drop some body weight since he had gotten so heavy. He also shaved his head for a new look for the Fry match. Naoya Ogawa did the same fasting thing to drop about 30 pounds, which made him look better for his role. One would think fasting is the worst way to drop weight, particularly for an athlete who is on occasion doing real shoots, but in Zen Buddhism, it's not an uncommon diet. It looks like Fujita will fight a name K1 star. Names talked about this week include Cyril Abidi, or their company giant, Jan Norkia, billed at 6'11". He's very tall, but not nearly that tall, and 310 pounds fighting weight. The latter is a real number since they do weigh-ins on the August 19th Saitama Super Arena. This becomes a major risk for New Japan to send its world heavyweight champion into a shoot environment, particularly if the rules aren't to their advantage. Kendo Kashin did an interview regarding his July 29th Pride match with Ryan Gracie, basically saying that if he were to lose again, he would retire. Pride announced this week that match will be the main event, with Kazushi Sakuraba versus Quinton Jackson as the semi-final. Tatsumi Fujinami said he hoped even if he lost that he would come back to New Japan. If he loses as badly as the first time, his pro wrestling career will be in a lot of trouble because he never regained his heat from his first loss. Kensuke Sasaki's return is scheduled for October 8th at the Tokyo Dome. This group is continuing to try and put together a deal for Dilip Singh that we've talked about, perhaps with the idea of training him in their style for several months and debuting him next year. July 14th TV was a typical show with mainly good matches. Geto and Jado and Chris Candido beat El Samurai and Negro Casas and Katsuyori Shibata when Jado used a Benoit crossface as his finisher on Casas. Last 5 minutes aired. Geto and Jado and Candido continued the beating after the match until Jushin Liger, Wataru Inoue and Minoru Tanaka did a run-in. They ended up getting beaten down when Hiro Saito and Akira helped out their Team 2000 members. 2 3/4 stars. This led directly to Tanaka and Liger beating Saito and Akira. Lots of good wrestling here, especially Tanaka and Akira were great. Geto and Jado kept interfering and posted Tanaka. Tanaka finally got the submission with the armbar on Akira. Geto and Jado tried to interfere again, but Samurai and Shibata stopped them. 3 1/2 stars. Super J pinned Yu Takayoshi in 9:57, second half only aired, after a choke slam. Physically stiff match, but not good. 1/2 stars. Riki Choshu and Fujinami and Yuji Nagata beat Scott Hall and Tatsutoshi Goto and Michiyoshi Ohara in 9:36. Better match than it sounds because Nagata worked most of the way. Nagata did MMA spots and positioning when in with Ohara. Fujinami only worked a few seconds, and Choshu at least did his thing when he was in. The heel team wasn't much, but Hall at least can do some comedy and Ohara tries, and Nagata could carry them both. 2 1/2 stars. Main was a non-title surprise as Manabu Nakanishi and Osamu Nishimura beat Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Satoshi Kojima in 1808. Second half only aired. Real good. Nishimura has no charisma and physically looks weak in the upper body, but his actual wrestling was very good. Nakanishi works well with Tenzan and Kojima because they've been matched up so much. Nishimura's pin on Tenzan with a sunset flip was a big surprise. Doesn't seem to make much sense, particularly 1 week before Tenzan and Kojima became the first team to reach one consecutive year as IWGP Tag Champs. Crowd popped with big for it because they didn't see it coming. 3¼ stars. Other Japan notes. The predictions for the Sunday Diet congressional elections in Japan are that Atsushi Onita, because his name recognition is so high, will likely win. Satoru Sayama, because his name isn't nearly as big even though he's been campaigning seriously, and think of how strange this is, under his famous original Tiger Mask persona, is not expected to win. Yes, he's going around his district with a mask on asking people to vote for him. It's hard enough to trust politicians when you can see their face, but I'd never trust a politician wearing a mask, because wrestling people are so into swerving, and a vote for La Parka may be a vote for Diamond Dallas Page, and that, my friends, is scary. Woman wrestling star Yumiko Hata is also considered to have little or no chance. Complete Ring's 10th anniversary show on August 11th at the Tokyo Ariake Coliseum will feature semi-finals and finals to create a middleweight, under 198 pounds, champion with Christopher Haseman vs. Gustavo Shimu and Jeremy Horn vs. Ricardo Arona, and a heavyweight champion with Mikhail Ilyukhin vs. Bobby Hoffman and Fedor Yemelyanenko vs. Renato Babalu, plus the Yoshiaki Fujiwara vs. Folk Han exhibition match, Folk Adida vs. New Japan's Michiyoshi Ohara, so they are going through with it after all, as well as Tsuyoshi Kosaka vs. Grom Koba and Hiramistu Kanehara vs. Matt Hughes. The Deep Promotion announced its second show on August 18th at Yokohama Bunka Gym, which is a weird shoot show featuring a lot of Pancrase stars and some pro wrestlers. The main event is Yuki Kondo, Pancrase's biggest star, against Brazilian Paulo Filho. Pro wrestler Takahiro Murahama, Osaka Pro Wrestling, who was involved in a Match of the Year candidate with Minoru Tanaka in New Japan earlier this year, faces Yoak Roque, a Brazilian MMA veteran with something of a big name. Rogério Nogueira, the twin brother of Rodrigo Nogueira, who faces Mark Coleman on July 29th in Pride, will face Pancrase's Katsuhisa Fuji. Former Rings prelim fighter Wataru Sakata faces Adrian Serrano, a Midwest independent wrestler whose background has included UFC and Pancrase as a journeyman-level fighter. Dos Caras Jr., don't know if he'll wear the mask or not, but if he does, he would be the first guy to compete in a shoot fight that I'm aware of wearing a mask. Son of the Hall of Fame wrestler, faces Kengo, Pancrase's most charismatic fighter. Dos Caras Jr. was a top-level amateur wrestler in Mexico and a 2000 Olympic hopeful. The caliber of Mexican Greco-Roman heavyweights isn't exactly world-class. The weirdest match of all has Kazuki Okubo against 52-year-old former Mexican wrestling superstar Kato Kung Lee, Johnny Lozcano, who had a hell of a shooter rep back in the late 70s and early 80s as he came out of Panama as this legendary street fighter. But a 52-year-old guy doing a shoot match, let alone Kato Kung Lee, who may be chronologically that age, but like many pro wrestlers, because of the lifestyle is quite a bit older, internally probably closer to the century mark, is very scary. Let alone the idea of a guy doing a shoot fight named Kato Kung Lee. Pancrase's Kosei Kubota faces former Rings wrestler Ryuki Wayama. Great Sasuke retained the NWA middleweight title against Curryman Christopher Daniels in 1910 with a small package on July 21st in Akita. Tsubasa and Black Buffalo, Yoshito Sugimoto, won the Osaka Pro Wrestling tag titles from Super Delphin and Takahiro Murahama on July 21st in Osaka. A sports drink called Aqua Energy, marketed around Hashimoto, is, along with Hashimoto-produced bento lunch set, being marketed at convenience sports throughout Japan. Toriuman had two big matches this past week, as on July 19th in Kagoshima before 1,500, Chima and Suwa and Big Fuji kept the Uwa Trio's belts over M2K, Susumu Mochizuki and Yasushi Kanda and Darkness Dragon, the July 20th at Hakata Star Lanes. Also before 1,500 the day before Noah sold the building out, saw Magnum Tokyo retain the British junior title over former champ Masaaki Mochizuki. JD promoted a shoot match between woman wrestlers using remix rules, 30 seconds on the ground before a stand-up, on July 22nd at Korakuen Hall with Yoko Takahashi beating Junko Yagi. Both women have prior experience in real matches and have real combat sports backgrounds before pro wrestling. Yagi, from judo, got pounded on by Takahashi, with a striking background, standing, and got bloodied up real bad, but hung in to go the distance, losing by decision. Takahashi, after winning, challenged both Aaron Toril and AJW's world champion Kaoru Ito. FMW on August 3rd at Korakuen Hall is doing a main event with owner Shoichi Arai vs. Koto Fuyuki, with a winner getting to own the company. Here and there. Matches added to the August 9th Brian Pillman Memorial Show in Cincinnati this week are 3 ways with DDP vs. Kenyon vs. Booker T, Kidman vs. Lynn vs. X-Pac, Malenko and Saturn vs. Raven and Credible, Corino vs. David Flair for the NWA title, and Hugh Morris vs. Mark Henry. Former Detroit News Pro Wrestling columnist Jim Thompson has a warrant issue for his arrest after failing to meet with his probation officer for more than a month and is now under investigation for more sexual crimes. Thompson, who wrote a weekly comedy column on wrestling under the pen name ML Curley, was released early after spending less than 1 year in prison after pleading no contest to second and fourth degree criminal sexual assault for fondling 12 and 14-year-old brothers in his sports car. He was sentenced to 1 year but was released early on good behavior. Thompson, 56, received a lot of coverage because when he was arrested his apartment was found with 35 years worth of photos of supposedly 1,200 boys he had asked to torture him. Thompson is being investigated regarding allegedly approaching 3 boys last month at a shopping mall and offering them $3,000 to torture him. According to a Zai's TV report in Detroit, shortly after Thompson's release, police started getting complaints about a weirdo stalking teenagers at the Port Huron and Birchwood malls. Thompson, after his release, was working at the Birchwood Mall selling clothes. Police went to question him after the 3 17-year-old boys confessed to torturing him for money, but Thompson disappeared, last being seen on June 8. The August 11th Terry Gordy Memorial Show in Birmingham lineup includes Michael Hayes and Ray Gordy vs. Dirty White Boy and a mystery partner. In little-remembered trivia, Gordy actually debuted the Dirty White Boy name and gimmick in wrestling in 1982 while wrestling for Southeastern Championship Wrestling and called himself the Dirty White Boy on interviews in Georgia. Tony Anthony, who wrestled for years under that name, was teaming with Lynn Denton as the Grapplers in several territories before they went to Memphis a year or so later using the name, which explains the significance of this match. Also Robert Fuller and Jimmy Golden and Jerry Stubbs vs. Bob and Scott Armstrong and Ron Fuller, Buddy Lendell vs. Tommy Rich, Honky Tonk Man vs. and Bobby Eaton vs. Robert Gibson. Former Gold Club dancer Jana Friedrich Pelnies on July 23 testified in the Gold Club trial going on in Atlanta that she performed sexual favors for the wife of Eric Bischoff after the couple came to the club and took her to a nearby hotel. Pelnies said that Bischoff's wife had given her $200 before they got to the hotel. When she got back to the club later that night, Pelnies said owner Steve Kaplan, who is on trial for racketeering with the government claiming the club was a front for prostitution among other things, gave her another $800 when she told him how much the Bischoffs had given her and asked if they treated her well. Bischoff testified the next day, vaguely admitting the story. Bischoff said, after about somewhere between 13 and 20 beers, he's not sure who did what. Bischoff said he didn't recall any intercourse, but he thought his wife and Pelnies had been a twosome while he watched. He claimed it was a spontaneous thing and not an act of prostitution. He said he and his wife spent the evening at the world-renowned strip club and invited Pelnies to a nearby hotel after an evening of sexual innuendo. Bischoff said he gave Pelnies $75 to $100 after dropping her off after leaving the hotel, but said the money wasn't for sex, but because he wasn't sure if she had been tipped for dances earlier that night. Alex K.O. Perez, a veteran Texas wrestler who wrestled for nearly 30 years, passed away on June 29 at the age of 71. Perez, a former Texas State Golden Gloves boxing champion, started pro wrestling in 1952 as a protege of Dory Funk Sr. in Amarillo. With his quick hands, he was something of a policeman in the Tennessee, Texas, and Florida territories at different points in his career and was still active at least through the late 70s and maybe early 80s. There was another wrestler out of Florida who worked in Texas in the 80s also named Alex Perez, who was a world champion with World Class in the late 80s and would in his early 40s now, that because they had the same name, although looked altogether different, he was sometimes confused with. Perez was a prelim journeyman type in the early 70s in the Amarillo territory when Bob Backlund, Jumbo Tsuruta and Stan Hansen were breaking in. Another wrestling death in the media took place this past week in Roaring River, North Carolina. According to the local newspaper, Derek Garland, 9, died on July 17 after wrestling with his 16-year-old potential future stepbrother Jason Crabb, who weighed approximately 225 pounds according to media reports while Garland weighed about 65 pounds. Howard Leary, the Wilkes County coroner, said the two boys, who always hung out and played together, were mimicking moves they had seen on pro wrestling when Crabb, who according to media reports, was somewhat slow mentally, flipped Garland over. The 9-year-old landed on his head on the floor and suffered a broken neck, which was listed as the cause of death. Julie Garland, mother, who is engaged to Crabb's father, was quoted in the Winston-Salem Journal as blaming wrestling, saying it might have been prevented if kids weren't allowed to watch wrestling on TV. She said her son loved wrestling, but she didn't approve of it and had tried to discourage his interest and wouldn't let him have any pro wrestling memorabilia. This turned into a national news story with nearly every media outlet tying it into the Lionel Tate case, which due to the media headlines, was terribly damaging to pro wrestling in the TV world and a reason several small promotions, as well as prospective startups of late, have run into roadblocks clearing television. Gary Davis, VP of Corporate Relations of WWFE, and David Walsh of the National Institute of Media and Family debated the wrestling as an influence on children issue on MSNBC on July 24. Davis noted that kids roughhousing with each other is not a new phenomenon and kids have always acted out what they see on TV, whether wrestling or otherwise. He said many kids take positives from wrestling, noting a letter from a young woman that was just accepted into Princeton who said watching wrestling gave her inspiration to achieve her dream. Walsh said the difference with wrestling is there is nothing wrong with a kid wanting to emulate a baseball player and practicing baseball, but it is dangerous for kids to imitate pro wrestling, saying there have been many deaths and injuries that have resulted from it. When the host Chris Jansing brought up Lionel Tate at that point, Walsh passed it off as a legal issue that isn't his field rather than using Tate's case as an example. He brought up that several deaths, we know of one, and many injuries have occurred in backyard wrestling that never gets media coverage. Walsh said he sent a letter to Vince that WWF should air warnings before every show that the moves are dangerous and shouldn't be tried at home. WWF has aired a similar PSA numerous times on SmackDown. Davis noted the latter point and said, ultimately it's up to parents to monitor both what their kids are watching and what they are doing. Walsh agreed that parents have that responsibility, but said you can only go so far with that argument and it doesn't absolve WWF of all responsibility, noting the warnings have done nothing to solve any problems and that the WWF is still marketing heavily to children. Walsh then brought up that teachers are always coming up to him with horror stories about language and disrespect of children and that many specifically point to kids imitating WWF characters in that regard. Davis, as a defense, brought up that many schools welcome WWF performers with open arms to speak about the importance of an education. Time ran out at this point. Hulk Hogan claimed on July 24 that he's put on hold all plans to run a promotion for at least 6 months, citing that there isn't interest among the major TV networks. Days earlier, people representing Hogan were still talking with a lot of people in wrestling and talking about a company where the key players would be Hogan, Jimmy Hart, Sting, who wouldn't be available until next year, Bret Hart, who I don't see involved in any pro wrestling venture now, and perhaps ever, Roddy Piper, who said he'd agreed to do it on a radio show over the weekend, Kevin Sullivan, whose Time Warner contract has either just expired or is about to end at the age of 51, as his first match in several years on August 17 for Florida Championship Wrestling, Sable and China when they are legally available. Sandman claimed on a radio show that he signed a contract with a guy from Evansville, Indiana to start a new full-time company which will have himself, Kurt Hennig, as World Heavyweight Champion, Mike Rotundo, Sabu, Public Enemy, as Tag Team Champions, Mikey Whipwreck, Steve Corino, Tracy Smothers, Nova, Chris Chetty, Balls Mahoney, Jack Victory, Francine, Simon Diamond, Don Marie, Little Guido and Tony Mamaluke as some of the top guys. The plan is to run Weekend 3 show loops like ECW did. They already have a debut in the ECW arena scheduled for August 11th and want to come back with a second show in September, as well as running a Danbury, Salisbury and Binghamton run that month. Johnny Walker, now 68, made what he calls his final appearance as Mr. Wrestling 2 on July 17th at a farewell banquet in Columbus, Georgia, one of his old stomping grounds for a local independent promotion. He also did his trademark knee lift to help the babyface win the main event. There was a Lucha Libre show on July 21st at the Olympic in Los Angeles featuring EMLL stars, which drew 3,500 fans. On July 20th at the Bronco Bowl in Dallas, AAA ran a show, drawing only 1,500, which is half of what they drew on their previous show in the building. CZW and Jap Wrestling in the Jersey area are having a promotional feud. Mark and Jay Briscoe, who are working for both groups, have sided with CZW since it has TV and John Zandig gave them their first break. Rick Blade has sided with Jap. There was an incident at the ECCW show on July 20th in Bellingham, Washington. A group of ICP fans were heckling the wrestlers all night. Steve Corino worked the main event and got into a confrontation with one of the fans. The report we got was that a fan took a swing at Corino, who fired back and punched him in the eye, and Corino continued to punch him until wrestlers pulled him off. MMA. Nevada officially, as expected, and unanimously agreed to sanction MMA as a sport and made it official that UFC 33 would take place on September 28 at the Mandalay Bay Casino in Las Vegas. The Pride 15 pay-per-view, Taped July 29 in Saitama, will debut on Viewers' Choice Canada on August 17, which is 6 days after its DirecTV debut in the US. Frank Shamrock will be fighting on the K1 August 19 show in Saitama with the Pro Wrestling vs. K1 theme. No opponent has been announced. Jeff Osborne's Hook and Shoot show on July 14 in Evansville, Indiana drew 2,400 fans, its second biggest crowd. As a gimmick, they did a grappling-only 6-man tag team match which Osborne said was one of the most entertaining matches in the 5-year history of the promotion. Mike Bernardo in a press conference before the July 20 Nagoya K1 show said he thinks the idea of matching K1 versus Inoki guys is foolish. That show was a one-night tournament, seemingly put together for Bernardo to win. The tournament, which drew 9,000 fans to Rainbow Hall, which itself shows the decline in K1 when they couldn't sell out their big show of the year in that city, ended up being won by unknown Alexei Ignashov. Bernardo beat Great Takeru in the first round and in the second round survived a low blow from Lloyd Van Dam to win a decision. But because of the low blow, he was unable to come out in the finals, and Van Dam, after losing, who was basically eating and drinking in the dressing room since he figured he was through, was told he had to come out in the finals. Van Dam, no longer in the fighting frame of mind, lost the decision in a match he'd have been the favorite in. The show drew a 13.5 rating, which is lower than most, but not all, K1 shows have done over the past few years and is a second indication of its mainstream popularity fading due to not being able to get over new stars to the level the original class got over. However, the main event itself between Van Dam versus Ignashov being an unknown and Van Dam not being a big name, did do a 24.0 peak. The tournament co-favorite, Cyril Abidi, was knocked out by Andrew Thompson in 150 of the first round in the opening tournament round. Thompson was knocked out by Ignashov in 146. The next K1 will be in Las Vegas on August 11 with a one-night tournament for a berth in the K1 finals at the Tokyo Dome in December. Bracketing has Peter Aerts, the favorite, versus Noboru Uchida, Maurice Smith versus Jurgen Krota, Francisco Filio, co-favorite, versus Serge Ivanovich and Jeff Rufus versus Stefan Liko. Media Life magazine ran a story on UFC being back on cable, saying this will give Vince McMahon his only competition. They had quotes from Senator John McCain, who was the driving force behind it being kicked off cable in the first place, who said he was pleased to hear about new rule changes and hopes the changes make UFC a true sport and not a barbaric fight. UFC President Dana White said he hoped the rule changes lead to avoiding confrontation with people like McCain. He downplayed them being in competition with pro wrestling, but did think they were competition to boxing, but said he thought they could give both a run for their money if they get on television deal. Speaking of barbaric, there is talk of doing a Gary Goodridge versus Yoshiaki Yatsu rematch on the September 22 Pride show. They fought last year on October 31. Yatsu, who was a world-class amateur wrestler in the late 70s and was a big star in Japanese pro wrestling during the 80s and early 90s, can take a punch. Unfortunately, that isn't to his benefit in the long run. He took a brutal beating. Fans loved the fight because it was so action-packed, but Yatsu had no punch defense, and at his age, 44 then, 45 now, taking that kind of head trauma is so dangerous. Joel Gold and Brian Sobey are attempting to put together a syndicated full-contact fighter weekly TV show for the fall season. WWF. Raw on July 23 from Buffalo continued the main Angle Strong. Show opened with Heyman, McMahon's, and Austin doing an interview. Austin acted like he was jealous of Vince's affection for Rock and Angle. Interview seemed like it never ended, although Austin is a great talker. Before Angle came out, Austin challenged him. Angle suplexed Austin out of his boots and Austin left. RVD pinned Matt Hardy with a frog splash while Matt was sandwiched with a ladder to keep the hardcore title in 404. Van Dam was hip-tossed off the ladder and landed badly, nearly injuring his ankle. Earlier he did a Van Daminator off the ladder. Matt did a leg drop from 6 feet high off the ladder. RVD got a huge face pop for winning. They set up the 6-man elimination tables match for the main event. Kanyon got a speaking role doing a takeoff on his WCW catchphrase, "Now who better than Kanyon?" and calling himself the Invasion MVP. DDP explained that everything on SmackDown was a setup angle with he, Austin, and Deborah. Storm won the IC title from Albert in 156 when Morris hit Albert with the belt while the ref was distracted by Awesome. Big brawl with everyone ensued with WWF side cleaning house, Bradshaw power-bombing Jindrak and Kane choke slamming Kidman to end it. Tajiri beat Raven with a sidekick in 350. Tajiri's weakest match to date. Crowd was dead. Angle drank beer with the APA and liked it. Undertaker pinned Rhino in 235 with a choke slam. Although he beat him clean, Undertaker sold more for Rhino than he ever did for Angle or most anyone except your Austin and Triple H types. Page went after Sarah at the finish and Undertaker beat up Page, throwing him into the crowd, over the barricade back to ringside. Sarah put the boots to Page. He was taking such an unmerciful beating you almost wanted him to be saved. Taker went for a chair shot, but Page pulled Sarah in the path of the chair and she took the hit. Taker did the King Kong bit carrying a limp Sarah to the back, while Page ran away and drove off, but not before saying how much he was turned on seeing Sarah like that. Jericho beat Kanyon in 458 with the walls. Very good match and very good heat as well. Vince showed up and did this amazing performance to build up Rock's return, lifting his suspension, doing his catchphrases. He asked Rock to come back for the fans. Crowd was going nuts for this. Angle confronted Vince and said he agreed Rock should be brought back but he still wanted to be a leader and pin Vince up against the wall. Backstage, Trish tried to slap Wilson for hitting on Jeff. They had a paddle on a pole match which ended with Wilson getting the paddle and spanking her in 226. This was bad. Elimination match with Edge and Christian and Angle versus Dudley's and Booker. 3D on Christian through a table. Booker gave Edge a sidewalk slam putting him through a table making it 3-on-1. They had some problems here. Angle suplexed Devon on a table that didn't break. Second suplex broke the table. Angle slam on Booker on a table that didn't break, so had to whip him hard through a vertical table to eliminate him. This left Bubba versus Kurt. Bubba punched Earl Hebner, bringing out Patrick. Angle slam on Bubba, but Patrick moved the table. Angle went crazy putting Patrick in the ankle lock on the table. Austin came out and attacked Angle, giving him a stunner and Bubba powerbombed Angle through a table in 15:06. There was no ref, nor any announcement of a finish. All the WWF guys ran out, leaving Austin and crew to run away. SmackDown on July 24th in Pittsburgh notes. One interesting result on Heat is that Bob Holly pinned Awesome clean. The WWF talent, read that Undertaker, that had worked with Awesome had not been impressed and I guess this is the result. Before the show went on the air, Jr. again gave the speech about Austin to make sure nobody cheered him. Hardys beat Kidman and Helms when Jeff pinned Helms with a swanton in a good match. Show and Gunn talk about how bad their gimmicks have been in the past, so they came up with their own gimmicks, the Shoguns. Perversely funny I guess. The bad guys came out with all the belt holders, Palumbo, O'Hare, Kidman, RVD, Big Babyface Pop, Storm, Booker, and Austin. Kanyon was also out there and they simply said Kanyon was the new US champ and Booker gave him the belt. What's even the point of having it? They should just make 40 belts that way everyone can have one, and every match on the card can be a championship match. Angle came out to a gigantic pop since it was in Pittsburgh and he's suddenly the hometown hero. Fans chanted for him all night like he was Lawler in Memphis or something. Austin insulted Pittsburgh. Angle challenged him to a title match but Austin said on some other day, but instead told him to wrestle Booker for his belt first. Dudley's beat Shoguns with a 3D on Gunn. They officially announced Rock returning on the July 30th Raw in Philadelphia. Booker starts mouthing off about Rock, so I guess that's the semi at SummerSlam. Page beat Kane via DQ when Kane used a chair for a cheap finish, but that was to put heat on Patrick. Page hit Kane with a chair after the match, but Kane no-sold it and chased Page away so Kane choke-slammed Patrick. Kanyon and RVD beat Tajiri and Jericho when RVD pinned Tajiri with a frog splash after Kanyon hit him with his US belt. Fans cheered RVD the entire match. Terry grabbed the mop and told Saturn he had to choose, her or the mop. Obvious decision. Storm beat Saturn via DQ in an icy match when Storm tried to attack the mop, but Saturn saved it and used it on Storm for the DQ. Shane, Stephanie and Heyman did an interview showing all the times Vince screwed Rock over trying to recruit him. Edge and Christian beat Taz and Rhino when Taz had Christian choked up but Rhino gored both of them, and Christian fell on top for the pin. Maine saw Angle win the belt. Big brawl with everyone around ringside. Kanyon used a chair on Angle for a false finish. Austin gave Angle the stunner again. As Booker celebrated, when he went for the pin, Angle got the ankle lock and Booker tapped. Said to be a great match. SmackDown on July 19th from Boston was an excellent show. The work rate was back up to the level it was before everyone got hurt. With DDP versus Jericho, Christian versus Storm and Van Dam and Kidman versus X-Pac and Jeff Hardy all real good, a strong build for the pay-per-view. Nick Patrick did a hell of a job bouncing around making a physical confrontation involving Earl Hebner and Trish Stratus actually not be too bad. Some more notes from Buffalo. Apparently a metal/jacked match with Helms and Guerrero over Kaientai was real good. Before the Raw show started, Ross did a big speech ripping on Austin, to make sure the crowd wouldn't cheer him when he came out a few minutes later when they were on the air. As it was, the crowd didn't cheer or boo Austin, but Ross got a big pop. Darrow got the boot on Tough Enough. He actually got funny the last week, but he just wasn't getting it down. If Taz, Snow, Big Jim, Terry Pac, etc. thought about ratings, they'd have kept him in just so people could get mad at him for another week. The big thing on the show was dinner at the house with Pat Patterson. There's something about this crew of people whose life dreams it is to wrestle for the WWF, and none of them had clue what Patterson's job even was or who he was, other than the guy who played one of Vince's stooges. The Joni Lauer Star tabloid interview mainly focused on her discovering the relationship between her boyfriend at the time, Triple H, and Stephanie McMahon. One thing about the Star is that you can't count on the quotes being real, so take this with a grain of salt. But it said she was suspicious the two were having an affair and confronted them, and they admitted it. She said, and she said this elsewhere, that she was hoping to marry Triple H. She didn't blame the breakup on her leaving the WWF, saying it was because they didn't offer her enough money in the recent negotiations. Remember last week's WWF website version of the history of WCW? Contrast this with their version of the history of ECW. For years, sports entertainment fans shared their opinions on how the industry rose from the depths of despair in 1995 to the billion-dollar entity it is today. It's simple. Once ECW began making a name for itself in 1995, fans started to care again. Tired of watching something that Vince McMahon eventually admitted was passé and of which the audience was tired of having its intelligence insulted, fans looked at ECW as a return to the roots of sports entertainment. ECW had violence. It had passion. Fans felt like they were part of the show. Best of all, ECW had attitude, and it provided the US a mix of barbaric commotion and athleticism only seen in Japan. It was no coincidence that the Big Two began seeing ECW as an innovative influence. ECW helped win back old school fans and helped change the industry for good. Gone were the days of Saturday morning wrestling on local channels. Gone were the days of the good guys kissing babies and shaking hands. And gone were the gimmicks better suited for children's theater. Thank ECW for that. And thank ECW for turning Aldo Montoya into just incredible, for showing us the true talent of the Dudley Boys, Taz, Rhino, Lance Storm, Raven, Tommy Dreamer and Rob Van Dam, to name a few, and for displaying the true genius of Paul Heyman. Today, the magic is back and then some. Heyman's creativity is backed up by Stephanie McMahon Helmsley and her billions of dollars. It's a winning combination, one that will provide the same hardcore, close to the heart theater that defined ECW, this time on a much grander stage. That line about Saturday morning wrestling on local channels is really funny, as if ECW had anything to do with WWF starting on prime time, which took place in 1984, or Ted Turner agreeing to Eric Bischoff's proposal to start Nitro. But why not? They still do that. Vince took wrestling out of smoky arena stories, which had more to do with smoking laws being passed in the same major arenas that wrestling had always run in. WWF has reached a business deal with Sony Music Video for distribution of WWF videotapes and DVDs to retail outlets. It will kick off with release of DVDs of Judgment Day and Hardcore and a new Best of Raw and King of the Ring VHS tapes. The Canadian rock band Our Lady Peace song Whatever is going to be used as the entrance music for Benoit when he returns. Add Kane to the Dudley Chef Boyardee TV commercial that was filmed last week. A correction from last week. David Cash isn't signed to a WWF deal. I believe when I asked about Kid Cash being under contract, it was probably confused with Kid Romeo. Ross did a lengthy press conference on July 12. No major new ground broken. Said that ECW may not have had the number of fans WCW had, but WCW eroded its fan base by the way they did business, and the ECW fan base was much more vocal and exuberant about the product. Talked about Sting, saying at 42, Sting had other priorities in his life like his family and wasn't interested in going back on the road. Said they were interested in Flair and Goldberg but the economics aren't there. Said a lot of the talent that hasn't been used on TV they have under contract, like the Johnny the Bull types, names mentioned in last week's issue, will likely be sent to HWA, OVW or IWA, and said the company made a mistake in letting them get rusty. Said this wasn't the time to introduce them on television because fans have so many new characters already all at once to get interested in. Unless it's someone really major, this is probably the worst time possible to introduce a new character. Said the goal was still long-term to have two separate promotions each with one weekly primetime show, but said there is no timetable for that to happen. Said with all the other things that have taken priority, there has been no thought as to the women's title but figured at some point there was a good shot of a tournament. Said the announcing positions were up in the air. Said he and Michael Cole was only a temporary thing. Talked about Snow being a regular on Heat. Said that he expected that Lawler would be in at some point, but no time soon, as he has personal issues to deal with first. Said that Show and Gunn seem to have a fit as a tag team. Said Angle has a chance to be the next major superstar. Said the locker room situation in Tacoma was uncomfortable, but has gotten better since then, and there have been no issues with anyone in WCW that have been serious with the exception of Bagwell. Said they met with Foley last week. Foley was overwhelmed by all the promotional work for his book, plus his main goal now was to write a fiction novel and some children's books. They want to come up with a reoccurring role for him but nothing specific has been decided. He also talked about Matt Hardy being a heel, but not Jeff, and noted that the APA was selling a lot of merchandise for two guys who weren't featured on TV. Well, now they're being featured. Joni Lauer did a Boston radio interview on July 19 saying she was both excited and scared to no longer be Chyna. Said she was surprised when WWF informed her they were calling off negotiations, and she wants to continue in wrestling. She blamed the purchase of WCW and the monolopy of the Major League business as the reason she didn't get the offer she wanted. She said the WWF offer didn't allow her to move forward. Translated, she wanted to not work house shows and have the body of the week off to concentrate on getting acting roles, while still maintaining a highly paid wrestling contract, and it just didn't work. There is more fear of job security in the locker room now than ever before, with so many wrestlers having been signed and the feeling there is no other place to work. Because of the feeling that unless you're a tippity top guy, it's out of sight, out of mind, and many wrestlers are either hiding serious injuries or downplaying them so they aren't off TV and forgotten about. In addition, for similar reasons, those who know are saying the steroid use because of the pressure to look good and get a spot is at an all-time high. Some Ross Report notes for this week. Spike Dudley should be able to wrestle in about 2 weeks. Goodfather should be back in 1 week. Blackman should be back soon from his hip injury. Pegged Rock's return as July 30th, but that it could change. Said he expects WWF to start running 2 house shows every Saturday and Sunday, an A show and a B show, starting in October, so that more of the roster can get work. This will likely avoid any massive cuts that, had the company not gone to 2 crews, would have likely happened just because they wouldn't have had use for this large of a roster. As you can see from the June business comparisons, and they remained constant in July, arena business in general is way down from the peak period. The road shows are still profitable because they are routed in a way to minimize travel expenses in most cases. The Toronto-Fort Lauderdale deal was an aberration a few weeks back because the company had a commitment to run the ACC so many times per year and it was the only date it could get. While Raw ratings have come up and Rock is returning, the movement of house show business, which I would expect to happen, hasn't happened yet. Until Rock comes back, and really until the next few weeks, we won't know exactly what the current angle means or how much Rock adds. Ross on the Ross Report made one of those weird comments which said, "I can't blame internet sites for printing incorrect information that they receive from alleged inside sources within the business. These sources obviously have their own agendas and seem to be masters of half-truths. Sad state of affairs for these insecure, selfish people who dupe the media for their own benefit." It was pretty clear he was referring to reports that were supposedly leaked from a company source regarding a bloodletting. I think one can also read between the lines and see there is major heat in the office right now. The story wasn't completely false in that if there were no use for people, they would be let go, and names were talked about in that vein, but none were officially let go, at least as of this writing. Some OVW notes. The entire month of July has turned into something of a disaster between surgery for Jim Cornette from a hernia suffered in a match last summer, but he was waiting until after the Last Dance show to take care of it since there are no major shows planned in the next few months, as well as Shelton Benjamin's elbow keeping him out at least another month. The Southern Tag titles he held with Brock Lesnar are held up and they are going to do a tournament, and Flash needing elbow surgery, so his OVW title will either be held up, but it's doubtful they'll do a second tournament just because of already having one, so they may just put the belt on someone, and is out 6 weeks at least. Solo, who wasn't really in the thick of things, with a broken ankle, Eric Angle's second tricep surgery, and even Donna Daring is out with a bad intestinal virus. I think the Cornette and Flash injuries will be done as Machine, Doug Basham hitting back at the OVW or something. To make things worse, one of the wrestling rings and the ring truck were stolen and found in a parking lot in Indiana with many of the parts stripped, so they needed to build a new ring and get a new ring truck, which forced cancellation of many of the house shows this month. Right now they are building things for September with a lot of new people coming in like David Flair, who is already in, Nathan Jones in a week or two, John Heidenreich, who will likely be programmed with Randy Orton, and Josh Wilcox, likely programmed with Damager. Chris Leary, who was given an announcing tryout last week, was hired to be the new host of Superstars. Triple H had been going to TVs the past 3 weeks helping with the booking of the shows. He was told by his doctors that all the traveling was getting him behind on rehab, and to stop leaving every week or his return to the ring will be delayed. He's taking the hint and won't be around much for now. Fashion faux pas at the pay-per-view. Van Dam, unbeknownst to him, when he got his airbrush tights, had a skull on it, which is Austin's gimmick. The feeling on Van Dam was mixed after the show. Many thought he was awesome since his match stole the show,